Welcome to Unholy Inquiry, where each tale leads you deeper into a labyrinth of mystery waiting to be uncovered. This time, join us as we delve into Miss Marple and the Bride Who Wore Black Lace, a fan-crafted story that pays homage to the genius and sophistication of Agatha Christie's iconic detective, Miss Marplet. We are thrilled to have you with us on this captivating journey. Share your thoughts, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you spot any details we missed, your feedback is invaluable. Together, let's continue to shape even more thrilling enigmas. Chapter 1. The Bride Who Vanished at Dusk. The wedding bells had barely faded into the evening sky when the first sign of something amiss rippled through the grand hall of Ashbury Manor. Guests, draped in satin and lace, lingered over the last sips of champagne, laughing politely at the faint drizzle tapping against the stained glass windows. Outside, the sky had dimmed to a melancholy violet, rain streaking the perfectly manicured gardens in silvered threads. Yet inside, the air was thick with celebration, the scent of lilies and damp earth mingling with the rich aroma of roast pheasant and clotted cream. It was, by all appearances, the perfect union of Eleanor Wainwright and Thomas Cavendish, a match praised by families and whispered about in village parlors for months. And then, just as the orchestra struck a sprightly waltz, Eleanor was gone. It was subtle at first, a few murmurs, a glance, exchanged across the polished oak floor. Thomas's arm brushed empty air where his bride had been moments before, and a ripple of confusion turned quickly to alarm. Chairs scraped back, the violins screeched to a halt, and the entire assembly fell into a brittle silence. Miss Marple, quietly perched near the window with her knitting basket in her lap, had not looked up yet, but her sharp eyes had already taken in the scene. The bride's chair, still angled toward the table, bore no sign of disturbance. The window nearest her, though slightly ajar, showed only rain-soaked shrubs and nothing more. A hush spread like fog through the hall. She was here," whispered Lady Ashbury, her voice trembling over the hushed murmurs. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. Her hands remained folded, her knitting untouched, but her mind raced. There was no sign of panic among the staff, no scuffing of shoes or hastily dropped trays. The bride had vanished without so much as a ripple in the satin. "Floor impossible," someone muttered. Yet Miss Marple, ever patient, allowed the panic to swirl around her while she observed. A fragment of lace caught in the carved edge of the grand piano, a delicate smear of mud on the heel of Thomas's left shoe. Tiny, almost invisible details, but details that would speak volumes to the observant. She rose quietly, drawing no attention, and stepped toward the piano. "It seems," she murmured to herself, "that our bride has left in a manner far more calculated than a simple lapse of attention." Her eyes fell on the lace fragment. It was torn cleanly, as though snagged deliberately rather than in a struggle. Kneeling, she examined the heel mark, fresh, small, and muddy in the shape of a very particular tread. Children's boots. That was curious. Eleanor had no siblings, no children in the family. Whoever had left in her stead, or with her, had involved a smaller person. It was subtle, easily missed, yet impossible for Miss Marple to ignore. The assembled guests now buzzed with speculation. "Perhaps she fainted," suggested a distant cousin, her voice quivering. "Or wandered into the garden," a maid whispered of a shadow glimpsed near the rose arbor. Thomas's face was pale, sweat beading his forehead despite the chill in the hall. "She wouldn't just leave," he insisted, voice low and taut, glancing at the empty space where his bride had been. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth in his assertion. Indeed, Eleanor would not have left without notice. She was methodical, careful, and devoted to decorum in every matter. Miss Marple allowed the staff to be questioned, listening quietly while noting the inconsistencies in their stories. The butler, ever precise, mentioned delivering the wedding cake to the outer hall. Yet Miss Marple had already spotted a smear of frosting along the edge of the door frame, leading to the servants' corridor, faint but telling. Someone had passed hurriedly, perhaps in the commotion, and had brushed against the wall. That was clue number 2, the hurried passage of someone familiar with the manor's nooks and crannies, someone likely to avoid the main corridors, and certainly someone not immediately visible to the guests. As the rain grew heavier, Miss Marple drew the gathered company toward the windows, pretending casual interest in the garden paths. "One must always look where eyes are least likely to fall," she said softly, her voice carrying authority without accusation. The near gaze lingered on the ivy that crawled the stone walls and the small, wrought-iron gate that led into the deeper woods. There, partially hidden beneath a bush, was the faint imprint of a heel identical to the one she had noticed earlier. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. Eleanor could not have gone there on her own. It was far too muddy, far too secluded. Yet someone had taken care to make this trail visible only to those who would notice the subtle signs. Meanwhile, the guests' chatter turned sour. Lady Ashbury accused the caterers of negligence. Thomas's mother muttered darkly about scandal. Miss Marple, however, continued to piece together the scene in her mind. Eleanor had been last seen descending the grand staircase. She had greeted nearly every guest with a smile. Nothing had been stolen, no note had been left. And yet, within the span of a minute, she had vanished entirely. That, Miss Marple realized, meant one of two things. Either Eleanor had vanished willingly, and with reason, or someone had orchestrated her disappearance with intimate knowledge of both her habits and the manner. Miss Marple turned to Thomas. "Have there been any recent quarrels, Mr. Cavendish? Tensions in the family? Friends who might object to your union?" Thomas shook his head, though the flicker of unease crossed his face, betrayed otherwise. "Nothing serious. Eleanor, she was happy." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Not unkindly, but with deliberate precision. Happiness rarely precluded motive. Sometimes the happiest faces concealed the most delicate of resentments. In the following hour, Miss Marple quietly questioned the household staff in the kitchen. A young maid, flushed from the heat of the ovens, confessed to seeing a figure near the servants' staircase, a figure with the distinctive gait of someone who did not belong to the household. She had assumed it was a delivery, perhaps a late-arriving guest, but the recognition of the tread, the same as she had glimpsed on the piano, made her falter. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was planned, precise, and executed under the guise of ordinary chaos. Meanwhile, the rain had begun to ease, leaving the gardens dripping and glistening under the waning light. Guests wandered the halls, speculating and whispering. But Miss Marple's attention shifted to the smaller details. A half-closed locket on a side table, a note partially hidden beneath the chair leg. A faint smell of lavender carried on the damp breeze. The locket contained a photograph of Eleanor as a child with an unfamiliar woman. Miss Marple pocketed it discreetly. There was a story here, one that connected past to present in ways not immediately visible. The note, merely a few words scrawled hastily, read, "Meet me where the light falters." Miss Marple's mind pieced together the first strands of a larger tapestry. Eleanor's disappearance was no whim. It was a message, a lure, and possibly a trap. The muddy footprints, the torn lace, the hastily written note, and the hidden locket, all clues pointing to someone with intimate knowledge of Eleanor's history and habits. Miss Marple, seated once more in her quiet corner with the rain's soft rhythm against the windows, began to map out the possibilities. The note suggested intention. The footprints suggested planning. The locket suggested motive. Whoever had orchestrated this knew the manor well, and they understood Eleanor intimately. By the dimming dusk, the household had grown tense and irritable. The bride's absence was a ghost that hung over the manor, palpable and oppressive. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her thoughts sharp and methodical. She considered the personalities in the room: Thomas, anxious and proud; Lady Ashbury, protective and defensive; the staff, loyal but frightened; and the guests, curious yet distracted. Beneath the polite smiles and forced reassurances, she could detect subtle tensions, an edge of resentment here, a hint of envy there, and the faintest trace of fear in one quiet corner. Then, as she traced her finger along the edge of the note, her eyes widened slightly. The handwriting was delicate, almost feminine, yet firm. Not Eleanor's, she thought, but it was someone close to her, someone who knew her inner habits, someone who could anticipate her responses. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. The first pieces were in place. The puzzle was forming. The vanishing at dusk was not the end. It was the beginning. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A breathless maid entered, holding a small, folded piece of paper. Miss Marple took it carefully. The note, written in the same delicate script, read simply, "If you value the truth, follow the garden path at midnight. Alone." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. Here was a daring clue, an invitation, or a warning. Whoever had taken Eleanor wanted her discovered, but only under conditions they controlled. And in that control lay danger, and perhaps revelation. The manor, which had moments before been a scene of celebration, now seemed a place of shadows and quiet menace. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the garden paths glistening in the pale light of an obscured moon. The guests had begun to murmur again, unaware of the deeper tension threading through the manor. Miss Marple rose slowly, her shawl settling around her shoulders, and gazed out at the darkened garden. Somewhere in the twisting paths and shadowed hedges lay the first key to understanding Eleanor's disappearance. The torn lace, the muddy footprints, the cryptic note, and the hidden locket all whispered that this was not merely a runaway bride, but a carefully orchestrated mystery demanding observation, deduction, and courage. And as dusk gave way to night, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of anticipation settle in her chest. The game had begun, and she intended to see it through. Somewhere beyond the manor's stone walls, someone was waiting. Someone with secrets, and someone who had underestimated the quiet, unassuming detective from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and whispered to herself, as only she could, "We shall see, Eleanor. We shall see indeed." The chapter ended with the first faint stirrings of movement along the glistening garden path, a shadow darting between hedges, leaving Miss Marple with the urgent, unmissable understanding that the night held more than mere answers. It held the first clue to a puzzle far larger than anyone yet imagined. The mystery was only beginning. Chapter 2: The locked room in Ashford Manor. The storm had returned to Ashford Manor with a vengeance, wind lashing against the leaded windows, rattling the heavy shutters and sending a chill that seemed to creep along the polished floors and shadowed corners of the old estate. Miss Marple had barely finished reviewing the strange, cryptic note that hinted at Eleanor Wainwright's disappearance when a piercing scream shattered the uneasy calm of the house. It came from the east wing, a high, thin sound that carried urgency and terror. The household froze, guests looking around with wide, frightened eyes, and the staff scattering like startled birds. Miss Marple, calm but alert, made her way toward the source, her sensible shoes barely making a sound on the thick rug. The scream had originated from the locked room at the end of the corridor, a small sitting room, rarely used, its windows shuttered and bolted, doors locked from the inside for months. Thomas Cavendish had tried the handle. The brass knob turned only with a hollow, mocking click. The maid had insisted the door was locked when she passed by just an hour before. Yet now, a voice, terrified, unmistakably human, had issued from within. Miss Marple approached, quietly asking herself the questions that had begun forming in the aftermath of Eleanor's vanishing. A locked room, a scream, a sealed door, and perhaps a body inside. The butler, pale as the rain-streaked sky outside, fumbled with the keys in his pocket, muttering that none of them would fit. Miss Marple, with her customary composure, tilted her head and observed the details. The hinges were polished, the floorboards pressed firmly, and the lock itself, though old, showed no signs of tampering. Rainwater had tracked in from the corridor, leaving a faint damp line that reached the threshold, but nothing more. She knelt, examining the lock carefully, and noticed a small scratch along the edge of the keyhole, almost invisible, but unmistakable to the practiced eye. Someone had attempted entry with a crude instrument, a temporary and delicate breach designed to fail. They wanted the door to remain sealed, yet convey a threat. "Open it," Thomas demanded, voice shaking. But Miss Marple's gentle, steady hand pressed his arm down. "Not yet," she said softly. "We must see first what the evidence is outside the room, what the signs are before we disturb the scene." She turned to the maid, who was wringing her hands. "Tell me everything you noticed in the corridor just now, the smallest detail, no matter how trivial it seems." The maid, stammering, pointed to a faint scuff near the base of the skirting board and a smudge of dust on the polished floor, hardly visible under the chandelier's light. Miss Marple nodded. Someone had leaned against the wall while attempting to open the door, quietly, deliberately, but with hesitation. The guests had gathered at the far end of the hallway, murmuring anxiously. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, however, remained on the floor. The scuff revealed direction, from the room toward the corridor. Miss Marple concluded that whoever, or whatever, had been in the room had left only recently. That meant the scream had occurred moments ago, not hours. Yet how, she wondered, could anyone leave a locked room from which there was no ordinary exit? Finally, the butler, trembling and muttering, managed to jolt the lock open with a heavy key from the master set. The door creaked on its hinges to reveal the sitting room, bathed in the cold grey light of a stormy evening. The curtains were drawn, the furniture pushed to odd angles as if someone had hurriedly searched the space. And there, in the centre of the room, lay the body of Mr. Edmund Hargrove, a minor but wealthy relation of Thomas Cavendish, sprawled across the Persian rug, eyes wide in shock. A letter opener, ornate and cruelly pointed, protruded from his chest. The room was empty of anyone else, the windows bolted from the inside, the fireplace cold, and the floorboards untouched except for Hargrove's own sprawled form. Miss Marple bent over the body, noting the angle of the wound, the position of the hands, and the slight indentation in the rug beneath his torso. The murder had been quick, precise, almost surgical in its execution, yet no ordinary human could have exited the room without opening the door. She observed the key lying discarded near the sideboard, Hargrove's own, still in the lock from the earlier attempt to secure the room. He had tried to lock himself in, perhaps in fear, perhaps to hide something, but had not survived. Her eyes drifted to the small blot of mud on the windowsill, faint but fresh, suggesting someone had leaned outside briefly or passed by in the garden moments before. Questions crowded her mind. Why Hargrove? Why this room? And why leave the door locked, giving the appearance of impossibility? As she rose, Thomas and Lady Ashbury watched anxiously, while the servants hovered like shadows in the corners. Miss Marple addressed them with gentle firmness. "Do not move anything, speak only if asked, and tell me, who last saw Mr. Hargrove alive?" A chorus of statements came, inconsistent and nervous. One guest claimed he had been in the library, another in the hall, and a maid swore she had seen him descend the east wing stairwell only minutes before the scream. Yet one detail stuck in Miss Marple's mind: the librarian's trembling admission that Hargrove had recently acquired an old diary belonging to a previous lord of Ashford Manor, containing hints of hidden inheritances and family secrets. Miss Marple's sharp mind noted the connection. Motive, opportunity, and now a carefully staged scene to suggest impossibility. The storm raged harder as she examined the window again. Though locked from inside, the sash showed signs of slight movement, a scratch, almost invisible, against the leaded panes. Someone had managed to manipulate it from outside with a small tool, perhaps a thin rod enough to create the illusion of a locked room. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the guests and staff. Who had access to such implements? Who had knowledge of the manor's quirks? And who would benefit from Hargrove's death? Thomas stepped forward, voice sharp with indignation. Who could do such a thing? It's impossible. There was no one in the room but him. Miss Marple raised a hand. Impossible is seldom truly so. One must observe, calculate, and understand motives before despairing at appearances. Hargrove's death is a message, deliberate in its presentation. Whoever did this intended for us to believe it could not have happened. She crouched again, inspecting the letter opener. The handle bore faint fingerprints, smudged by haste. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The murderer had used an item from the room itself, ensuring there would be no obvious trace leading to an outsider. She glanced at the rug, noticing tiny threads displaced near the baseboard. Someone had pressed close to the wall, perhaps to avoid leaving a heavier footprint, and yet the mud smudge betrayed them. The psychological element began to crystallize. Hargrove, proud and secretive, had likely known someone might come after the diary. His attempt to lock himself in the sitting room suggested panic and calculation. Yet he underestimated the ingenuity or boldness of the assailant. Miss Marple could almost sense the mind that had orchestrated this, patient, cunning, familiar with the manner, and unafraid to manipulate perception to create bewilderment. Miss Marple turned to the assembled household. Think, if you will, about the relationships here. Hargrove was not universally loved. He had recently quarreled with at least 2 relatives over inheritances. There were whispers of an affair, threats of exposure, and knowledge of secrets best kept in shadows. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room felt charged, as if the storm outside had moved into their very hearts. One of you, I suspect, acted with deliberation and subtlety. This is no rash act of passion. It is calculated and performed with an understanding of human psychology, of fear, pride, and secrecy. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple noticed something she had not before. A small slip of paper partially tucked beneath the desk, almost invisible. She retrieved it carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting was spidery, hurried, but unmistakably deliberate. The past cannot stay buried. Ashford knows. Midnight will reveal the rest. Her heart quickened. This was no ordinary murder note. It tied directly to Eleanor's disappearance, to Hargrove's fatal curiosity, and to secrets hidden within Ashford Manor itself. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the room, revealing a shadow in the far corner. One of the servants, pale and frozen. Miss Marple approached gently. The young woman admitted, in hushed, trembling tones, that she had overheard Hargrove arguing with someone outside the library, words about diaries, inheritances, and blackmail. Miss Marple's deduction sharpened. The murderer had motive, knowledge, and the ability to manipulate both perception and timing. The storm outside eased slightly, leaving the gardens shimmering under intermittent lightning. Yet within the manor, the atmosphere was taut, electric with suspicion. Miss Marple, holding the note and observing the scattered clues, the mud smudge, the displaced threads, the fingerprints, the diary, realized that Hargrove's death was the second act in a carefully staged drama, one that had begun with Eleanor's disappearance. Each event was linked, each clue deliberate, each misdirection a test of intellect. By the candlelight, Miss Marple addressed the room. We have a locked room murder and a vanished bride. Both are mysteries that demand patience, observation, and logic. There is a pattern here, one mind, I suspect, orchestrating both events. The question is, who has the knowledge, the motive, and the audacity to manipulate Ashford Manor so completely? The assembled guests looked uneasy, glancing at one another. Whispers arose, accusations half-formed, glances sharp and wary. Miss Marple's eyes swept the room once more, noting the subtle tremor in Lady Ashbury's hand, the sudden pallor on Thomas's cheek, and the nervous adjustment of the librarian's spectacles. Each gesture, each involuntary movement, spoke to her trained perception, revealing fears and hidden knowledge. Finally, Miss Marple turned to the windows, observing the garden paths slick with rain, the twisting shadows cast by the moon breaking through the clouds. There, just beyond the terrace, she noticed something, a faint shimmer of light, reflecting on metal, barely perceptible but deliberate, a clue, placed for discovery, or perhaps an oversight. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Whoever had staged the locked room murder had left an unintentional sign, and she intended to follow it. As the hour grew late, the manor felt suspended between past and present, secrets and revelations. Miss Marple, holding the cryptic note, the diary's fragment, and the observations she had gathered, knew that the answers lay just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. The storm had passed for now, but the turbulence within Ashford Manor was only beginning. And then, as she examined the final detail, the shimmer of metal outside, a sharp gust of wind rattled the windows, and the unmistakable outline of a figure appeared in the terrace's shadow, watching. Miss Marple's heart leapt, not with fear, but with certainty. Someone was returning, someone who knew she was close to uncovering the truth. The locked room murder was but the opening act. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The figure's presence was deliberate, a silent message, and as the candlelight flickered across the polished floors, she whispered to herself, "So, Ashford has more to reveal, and I must be ready." The chapter closed on the glint of that figure in the shadows, the sense of danger coiled tightly around the manor, and the understanding that the next act, one of confrontation, revelation, and perhaps another death, was imminent. The night had secrets yet, and Miss Marple would unravel them, thread by careful thread. Chapter 3. A Letter That Came Too Late. The postman arrived with his usual tardy punctuality, the rain still dripping from the brim of his sodden hat, as he handed over a thick envelope to the Cavendish household. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fireplace in the drawing-room, knitting in one hand and sipping her tea with the other, raised her eyebrows as the butler placed the envelope before her. It was addressed in a hurried, almost desperate hand, Mrs. Eleanor Wainwright, Ashbury Manor. The ink was smudged by rain, and the seal, delicate and unfamiliar, bore the faint imprint of a crest that Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. She set her knitting aside and studied the envelope carefully. The postmark was from a nearby village, delivered yesterday, but the contents had evidently taken the longer, less direct route to reach the manor. Thomas Cavendish, who had been pacing the length of the room with his tie askew, seized the envelope eagerly. Could this be about Eleanor? Perhaps someone has news, good news even. His voice trembled with hope, but Miss Marple shook her head ever so slightly, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her hat. "Hope can be a dangerous companion, Mr. Cavendish," she murmured. "We must examine this carefully before imagining miracles." The envelope was carefully slit with the tip of a letter opener. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, written in the same hurried scrawl as the address. The words were jagged, uneven, and carried the weight of urgency. "If you value Eleanor's life, look to Ashford Manor's East Wing. The answers lie with the one who knew her best, but beware, the one who watches from behind the smile." Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the paper, noting the uneven pressure of the pen, the slight indentation left from hurried writing, a detail indicating someone nervous or desperate, yet knowledgeable of Eleanor's habits. The drawing-room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the persistent tapping of rain against the windows. Thomas's excitement was palpable. "See, Miss Marple, this must be a clue. Someone knows something." Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her mind was already weaving threads of deduction. A note like this suggested intimate knowledge, not only of Eleanor herself, but also of the dynamics within Ashford Manor. Whoever had written it knew where to strike curiosity and where to plant fear. Miss Marple stood, placing the letter carefully in her reticule. She studied the room, noting the faint scent of lavender that had been lingering in the air, the faint scuff marks near the hearth, and the subtle smudge on the carpet leading to the sideboard. Each tiny detail told a story. The lavender, she realized, was not coincidental. It was Eleanor's favorite, yet someone had deliberately carried it here, perhaps to suggest her presence, perhaps to mislead. The scuff and smudge indicated movement, a hurried one, possibly from someone passing unnoticed. The pieces were small, yet, as always, they hinted at larger truths. The arrival of the letter immediately drew the attention of Lady Ashbury, who swept into the room, her expression a mixture of worry and indignation. A letter? At this hour? Who would send such a thing? And why not sooner? Perhaps it is a trick to torment us." Miss Marple's eyes followed Lady Ashbury as she spoke, noting the subtle tremor in her hands, the slight downturn of her mouth. Beneath the indignation lay fear, and beneath the fear, perhaps knowledge. Miss Marple filed that observation away for later scrutiny. "Miss Marple," Thomas said, urgency pressing through his words, "can this letter tell us where Eleanor is, or if she is safe at all?" Miss Marple drew a deep breath. The words were deliberate, yes, but they were also incomplete. Whoever wrote this had intended to provoke action, to manipulate those who would discover it. Yet there was meaning hidden in the phrasing. The one who knew her best, and behind the smile. These were the first threads of a hidden design, clues that would point towards someone close to Eleanor, someone trusted, yet possibly treacherous. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering the windows and gusts rattling the panes. Miss Marple's eyes turned toward the east wing, where the locked room murder had occurred just the previous evening. The letter's instruction seemed clear enough, yet she knew better than to rush blindly. A careful mind considers motive, opportunity, and subtle psychology before taking action. She gestured for Thomas to accompany her, and together they ascended the main staircase, each step creaking underfoot as if announcing their passage to the storm itself. The east wing corridor was dimly lit, the shadows cast by flickering wall sconces dancing like restless spirits on the faded wallpaper. Miss Marple moved slowly, noting the impressions left by previous movements. The faint smear of mud near the windowsill, the subtle indentation of footsteps pressed into the carpet, the slight shift in the pattern of the rugs from the previous night. These were the quiet signatures of movement, almost invisible yet unmistakable to a trained observer. She crouched, running her gloved fingers over the carpet and noting the direction. The traces led toward a small sitting area adjacent to the guest rooms, a place often overlooked. Thomas was fidgeting, whispering, "Could she really be here?" "Do you think—" Miss Marple raised a hand, cutting him off. "Patience, Mr. Cavendish. We must see the facts before we fill them with imagination." Her voice carried calm authority, compelling him to silence, if only temporarily. The sitting area bore signs of recent disturbance. A chair knocked slightly askew, a faint scratch along the edge of the wooden sideboard, and the lingering scent of lavender once more. Miss Marple crouched, noting the details. "This is no coincidence," she murmured. "The room has been visited very recently, perhaps even while the storm was at its peak. Whoever came here knew precisely what they were doing." She paused, examining a small, folded slip of paper, partially hidden beneath the armrest of the chair. Carefully, she removed it. The paper read simply, "Trust no smile. Watch the hand that offers comfort, and the truth will be revealed." Her eyes flicked to Thomas, then to the corridor. Subtle signs of tension, fear, and hidden motives rippled through the manor like an undercurrent beneath polite society. Mrs. Marple understood that the letter was a carefully orchestrated bait, designed to draw the family into action and perhaps reveal more than they intended. Whoever had sent it was clever, deeply familiar with human behavior, and unafraid to manipulate the anxiety that already gripped Ashford Manor. The discussion that followed in the dim corridor was fraught with tension. Thomas questioned whether to involve the police immediately, while Lady Ashbury fretted over the potential scandal. Miss Marple listened carefully, noting every hesitation, every evasive glance, and the subtle manner in which certain staff shifted their weight or avoided eye contact. These were more clues than casual behavior. They were the signs of concealed knowledge or fear. Returning to the drawing room with the letter secured in her reticule, Miss Marple examined the seal more closely. The crest, she realized, was that of a minor branch of the Wainwright family, long estranged but still known in certain circles. The sender was therefore someone with direct familial knowledge, someone who could speak to Eleanor's character, habits, and vulnerabilities. This narrowed the circle considerably. The words of the letter, combined with the handwriting, the use of formal phrasing, and the urgency, all pointed to a person capable of both affection and manipulation, someone whose intent was not merely to inform, but to compel. Night had fallen, casting the manor in deep shadow, the storm now reduced to intermittent gusts that rattled the shutters. Miss Marple settled herself in the drawing room, laying out her observations. The 2 letters, the torn lace from the previous chapter, the muddy footprints, the locked room murder, and now this urgent correspondence. Each detail formed part of a pattern, one that required careful observation and inference. She considered the psychological profile of the sender, someone driven by worry or fear, perhaps even guilt, someone desperate to intervene, but limited in ability or means. As she pondered, a soft knock at the door startled her. The maid entered, trembling slightly, and handed her another envelope, smaller this time, unmarked save for the initials EW. Miss Marple carefully opened it, finding a single sentence written in the same hurried hand. He will not wait. Seek the hidden passage beneath the library hearth. Her mind raced. A hidden passage beneath the library hearth? This was no ordinary instruction. It was a call to action, a clue placed deliberately for those sharp enough to notice. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edges of the paper, noting the indentation from the pen and the slight smudge of ash, suggesting that the letter had been hastily handled near the fireplace. Someone had placed it there recently, and its intent was clear. It was a warning, a guide, perhaps even a key to Eleanor's fate. She rose and moved toward the library, candle in hand, examining the hearth for signs of disturbance. Her eyes caught a faint line in the soot, barely perceptible but deliberate. Kneeling, she traced it with her gloved fingers, revealing a hidden seam in the stonework, a clue intentionally concealed yet discoverable to an observant mind. She straightened, a glimmer of satisfaction in her expression. Someone wanted Eleanor to be found, or at least for the truth to come to light, but only for those who could read the signs carefully. As Miss Marple stepped back, she sensed a presence behind her. She turned slowly, candle flickering, to see Thomas standing, wide-eyed and pale. "Miss Marple, do you think she's alive?" His voice trembled, betraying his hope and fear in equal measure. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That is yet to be determined, Mr. Cavendish. But I believe the letters are meant to guide us. Someone is trying, in their own way, to direct the outcome, and we must follow the trail with care." The storm outside had abated, leaving the garden paths slick and shining under a pallid moon. Shadows stretched across the manor's walls, and the air carried the faint, lingering scent of rain and lavender. Miss Marple glanced once more at the unopened envelope that had arrived too late, understanding fully that it held the threads of a much larger narrative, one that involved Eleanor's disappearance, Hargrove's death, and secrets hidden deep within the manor's walls. And then, from the corridor beyond, came the faintest sound of a footstep, deliberate and quiet, as though someone moved with care, watching, waiting. Miss Marple's heart did not quicken in fear, but in alertness. She set the letters down, adjusted her spectacles, and whispered softly to herself, "Ashford Manor is revealing its secrets, one shadow at a time, and the next step must be taken with utmost care." The chapter ended on that note of suspense. The letter had arrived too late, but it had opened a path, a challenge, and a warning. The hidden passage beneath the library hearth beckoned, and with it, the promise of discovery, danger, and revelation. Miss Marple, keenly observant and ever patient, knew that the truth awaited, concealed but deliberate, just beyond the flickering candlelight. Chapter 4. The Will That Was Never Signed. The storm had relented, leaving Ashford Manor drenched in a lingering dampness that seeped through the stone floors and made the tapestries cling heavily to the walls. Miss Marple sat quietly in the dimly lit study, the soft glow of a single candle casting shadows that danced like spectres across the shelves of leather-bound books. The earlier revelations, the vanished bride, the locked room murder, and the cryptic letters had left the household tense, each member tightly wound as if even the faintest sound might betray some hidden motive. It was precisely in such moments, Miss Marple knew, that truths often revealed themselves, unbidden but unmistakable. The peace of the room shattered when the butler, pallid and trembling, entered with a bundle of papers pressed to his chest. "Madam, I fear there is trouble with the late Lord Ashbury's will," he stammered. "It appears the signed version cannot be found." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The last will and testament of a recently deceased family patriarch was rarely a matter of minor consequence, particularly in a house already strained by suspicion and secrets. "Show me," she said quietly, gesturing toward the papers. The will, or rather the copies she was handed, were meticulously drafted, yet one crucial element was missing: the patriarch's signature. Miss Marple examined the document with her usual care, noting the folds, the indentation of the pen in certain places, and the faint trace of wax on the final page, residue from the sealing of the envelope in which it had been kept. Her trained eye detected two immediate clues. The lack of signature indicated that this copy had never carried legal weight, and the wax itself bore a faint smear, as though it had been handled by someone wearing gloves that were damp or soiled, possibly in haste. "Unsurprising," Miss Marple murmured, "that such a discovery would cause alarm." Her gaze swept the room, lingering on each member of the household who had gathered at the sound of the commotion. Thomas Cavendish stood stiffly by the fireplace, jaw tight, a hand brushing nervously along his lapel. Lady Ashbury's fingers drummed along the edge of her chair, her face pale and drawn, betraying worry that bordered on panic. The librarian, too, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, eyes flicking toward the door as though expecting someone or something to appear. The butler cleared his throat. "Madam, several family members have been asking about the contents, and tensions are rising. There is concern that without the signed will, claims to the estate might be contested." He glanced nervously toward the stairwell. "People are uneasy." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, observing the rain-soaked gardens and the silvered pathways beyond. "Unease is rarely baseless, Mr. Cavendish," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And when unease coincides with opportunity, one must be alert to motives that might otherwise remain hidden." She turned to the family members. "Tell me, who last saw the signed will?" The question was simple, yet its implications pressed like a weight upon the room. Thomas spoke first. his voice tight. "I believe it was my father's solicitor. He said he would bring it to the manor to be signed, but he never did." Lady Ashbury shook her head. "That is hardly sufficient explanation. Surely it should have been delivered and signed immediately. Delay breeds suspicion." Miss Marple nodded, making a mental note of the subtle tension in Lady Ashbury's voice. Beneath her concern for propriety lay a desire to protect certain interests, perhaps even her own. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the maid who had handed over the letters days before. She had grown quiet and watchful, her eyes revealing more than her words. "You were in the study last evening, were you not?" Miss Marple asked softly. The girl nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I dusted the shelves, and I saw someone place the documents on the desk. I did not touch them, madam." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The handwriting on the envelope, the wax seal, and the manner of placement all suggested care and familiarity with the study's routines. A clue, she realized, and an important one. Someone knew exactly where to leave or remove a document without attracting attention. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said aloud, "the signed will was never meant to be seen, or its absence has been contrived to serve a purpose." Her gaze swept the room again. The family members exchanged uneasy glances, each one instinctively aware that motives were being assessed, that silence now spoke louder than words. She moved toward the desk, examining the faint impression of handwriting on the top sheet. The pen strokes, though incomplete, suggested a practiced hand. Miss Marple could discern the likely shape of certain letters, the pressure indicating hesitation in some places, decisiveness in others. This was not a forgery, she concluded, but an incomplete act, a will prepared with intention but never finalized. That raised the question: who might benefit most from such incompletion? Who had the greatest interest in ensuring that no signature existed, leaving claims to the estate in uncertainty? The discussion in the room grew heated. Thomas suggested contacting the solicitor immediately. Lady Ashbury argued that discretion was required to prevent scandal. The librarian muttered about legal precedents. Miss Marple listened, noting the subtle tells in each person's behavior. Thomas's hand trembled slightly when speaking of inheritances, betraying desire. Lady Ashbury's gaze darted toward the study door repeatedly, suggesting anxiety over who had entered the room previously. The librarian's meticulous posture indicated concern for propriety and the preservation of knowledge, but perhaps also fear that some secret he knew would be revealed. Miss Marple returned to the study desk, examining a faint wax stain at the edge of the writing surface. It suggested that someone had removed a document hastily, or that the envelope had been handled improperly, leaving residue. She touched it lightly with her gloved finger, noting a slight grit embedded in the wax. Mud or fine dust, likely from shoes, pointed to movement during or after rain. The timing, she realized, was crucial. Whoever had handled the will did so recently, and in conditions that left subtle traces, but intended them to appear accidental. Miss Marple then considered the psychological implications. A missing will was more than a legal inconvenience. It was a tool of manipulation. Whoever had orchestrated this understood the family dynamics intimately. Fear, desire, greed, and anxiety were all being played upon subtly, with the missing document as leverage. Her mind turned over each member of the household. Thomas, anxious yet eager. Lady Ashbury, protective yet calculating. The solicitor, absent but crucial. And the maid, perhaps unwittingly involved. Each had opportunity and motive in varying degrees, and all would be tested by the absence of the signature. The next observation came unexpectedly. She noticed that one of the ledger books on the lower shelf had been shifted slightly, as if to conceal something beneath. Kneeling, Miss Marple carefully moved the ledger aside, revealing a small envelope hidden in the shadows. She retrieved it and examined the contents. A note, written in the same hurried hand as the earlier letters, addressed simply to E.W. It read, "The estate's secret lies not in signatures, but in the drawer beneath the hearth. Look there, and you will see what has been withheld." Her heart quickened with the realization that the missing will was only one part of a larger mystery, another layer of intent and deception, this one hidden deep within the manor's architecture. The East Wing, the letters, the missing will, they were all connected. Someone was orchestrating these events with care, ensuring that the truth was accessible only to those who observed carefully, who thought methodically, who understood the human mind, as well as the mechanisms of the manor itself. Miss Marple shared the discovery with Thomas and Lady Ashbury, watching closely as each reacted. Thomas's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Lady Ashbury's lips pressed into a thin line, betraying both concern and the faintest trace of calculation. Miss Marple observed the flicker of subtle recognition in her expression, a realization that someone within the family might have been manipulating circumstances for their own advantage. As evening deepened and shadows lengthened across the drawing room, the household grew tense, each member aware that the missing will was more than a legal document. It was a fulcrum of power and a test of trust. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, connecting the faint clues, the wax residue, the shifted ledger, the letters, the patterns of movement, and the behaviors of those present. Each piece reinforced the notion that the missing signature had been a deliberate act, designed to unsettle, to manipulate, and perhaps to conceal a deeper truth about Eleanor's disappearance. The candle flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. Miss Marple rose, adjusting her spectacles, and addressed the room in her gentle yet authoritative tone. "The will was never signed, yes, but that is merely the surface of the matter. The absence points to intention, and intention, carefully observed, always leaves traces." Her gaze fell on the shifted ledger. "I intend to see what is concealed beneath it, for it will tell us more than the document itself ever could." She knelt again, moving the ledger aside to reveal a narrow drawer, hidden from casual view, its surface worn from repeated handling. Inside lay a small bundle of papers, financial records, private letters, and a fragment of a document that appeared to be a draft of the will, annotated in pencil with careful notes. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the handwriting. The annotations were deliberate, revealing calculations, allocations, and subtle indications of disfavor towards certain family members. The missing signature now seemed almost secondary. The true power lay in the knowledge of the annotations, the hidden intent of the patriarch, and the careful manipulation of access. Suddenly, a faint noise from the corridor drew her attention. A soft shuffle, a whisper of movement. Miss Marple glanced up, candlelight catching the eyes of a figure retreating toward the shadows. She did not speak, but noted the furtive glance, the quick adjustment of gloves, the hesitancy in the steps. Someone was aware that she had discovered part of the hidden truth, and the atmosphere tightened with unspoken tension. Miss Marple replaced the ledger carefully, leaving the notes in her reticule. She turned to Thomas and Lady Ashbury. "The will that was never signed is not the end of this mystery. It is a clue, a guide, and a warning. Someone has sought to control knowledge, to manipulate perceptions, and to leave suspicion in their wake. We must consider all who had access, all who might benefit, and all who fear exposure. The household was quiet now, the storm outside fully spent, leaving the manor bathed in a pale, cold light. Shadows lingered in corners, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the stone halls. Miss Marple's mind worked, methodically, threading connections between the missing signature, Eleanor's disappearance, the letters, and the East Wing mysteries. Each element suggested deliberate orchestration, yet one mind had guided them all. She understood, as she always did, that patience, observation, and logic would reveal the architect of these schemes. And then a sudden tap at the window startled the room. Miss Marple turned slowly. Outside, just beyond the terrace, glinted a small, metallic object, half buried in the wet gravel, an envelope, sealed and weighted with a stone. She retrieved it carefully. Breaking the seal, she discovered a single line written in the now familiar hand. The answers you seek are closer than the signatures. Follow the path beneath the hearth before the night closes. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The missing will, the secret annotations, the letters, and now this final instruction pointed unmistakably to the library hearth, beneath which lay hidden knowledge crucial to Eleanor's fate. The chapter ended with the sense of imminent discovery, a gathering storm of revelations waiting just below the surface, and the certainty that the next step would be both perilous and illuminating. The game, Miss Marple knew, was far from over. Chapter 5. Shadows at the Midnight Train. The night was thick with fog, curling around the gas lamps of Ashbury Station and muting their light to a dull, ghostly glow. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the platform, her coat pulled tightly against the damp chill, her eyes sweeping the misty tracks. She had come, at Thomas Cavendish's insistence, his voice trembling with urgency over the possibility that someone connected to Eleanor's disappearance might be fleeing by train. The previous days had drawn a fine web of suspicion throughout Ashford Manor. The missing will, the letters, the hidden annotations, all pointing to a network of secrets that seemed poised to unravel with the smallest nudge. Tonight Miss Marple hoped to observe one such nudge in motion. A sudden whistle pierced the fog, announcing the arrival of the midnight train. Its steel wheels shrieked faintly, and the carriage lamps glimmered through the mist like distant stars. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as a figure emerged. On the far platform, moving swiftly, head down, umbrella tilted. There was something familiar about the gait, cautious, deliberate, yet purposeful. She raised her hand slightly to shield the candlelight she carried from the wet wind. Noting the glint of metal at the person's wrist, a small, ornate watch that gleamed faintly, catching the light just so. It was not common, and she remembered seeing such a timepiece in the manor, glimpsed once in a photograph of the late Lord Ashbury's study. "You see him, Miss Marple," Thomas whispered beside her, his voice tight with anticipation. She nodded, keeping her observations measured. "Yes, but observe carefully, Mr. Cavendish. It is not merely his movement, but what he carries, how he reacts to others on the platform, that will tell us more than any hurried guess." The stranger paused near a station bench, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone or something. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the stiffness of his steps, the way his fingers adjusted the lapel of his coat again and again. Anxiety and awareness of scrutiny were evident, as was an intent to remain unnoticed. She scribbled quietly in her notebook, capturing the details that might later link him to events at Ashford Manor. The watch, the umbrella with a frayed tip, the faint, lingering scent of lavender that drifted on the air despite the fog. Someone had brought that scent deliberately, she thought, a subtle echo of Eleanor, perhaps, or a diversion meant to confuse observers. As the train hissed into the station, the stranger slipped into one of the dimly lit carriages, leaving only the faintest impression of mud and raindrops on the platform. Miss Marple bent down to examine it. The footprints were fresh, and curiously, the sole pattern suggested a right-foot-first departure, as if the individual had been cautious in treading on wet ground, perhaps attempting to erase traces or mislead anyone following. A small scrap of paper, slightly crumpled, lay nearby, and she retrieved it carefully. It bore a fragment of handwriting. Beneath the east wing, before the hour. She tucked it into her reticule, noting that it matched the hurried style of the previous letters she had studied. The same slant, the same irregularity in pressure, the same urgency. Could it be? Thomas began, but Miss Marple cut him off. Do not speculate aloud. Observation first, interpretation second. Let us consider motive, opportunity, and context. She straightened, her eyes scanning the foggy tracks. The train's whistle sounded again, warning of its impending departure. She realized that the stranger's hurried escape could be an attempt to avoid confrontation or conceal a critical piece of evidence, possibly linked to the missing will or Eleanor's disappearance. The train lurched forward, the wheels rattling, and in that brief instant, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the person's face. It was partially obscured by the umbrella, yet enough to suggest recognition. The jawline, the angle of the nose, the shadow of a familiar expression. She made a mental note. Whoever this was, they were desperate yet calculated, moving with purpose that spoke of prior knowledge of Ashford Manor's secrets. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple and Thomas found the household unusually tense. Lady Ashbury was pacing, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes flicking to each shadow as though expecting intruders. The servants moved, silently, exchanging glances that betrayed unease. Miss Marple noted each reaction, filing them away. Fear has a rhythm, she murmured, almost to herself, and it can reveal more than confident speech ever will. In the drawing room, Miss Marple spread the scrap of paper on the table alongside the previous letters and annotations. She traced the hurried pencil marks with her finger, noting the punctuation, the spacing, and the placement. Each element was intentional. The phrase, "beneath the east wing," was consistent with prior instructions found in letters regarding hidden passages and cryptic warnings. The hour mentioned likely referenced a temporal urgency, the train's departure, or perhaps a meeting arranged under the cover of darkness. Thomas's voice was tight with frustration. Why would anyone send messages like this and then flee? Surely it is a ruse, a distraction. Miss Marple considered him carefully, noting the eagerness in his tone that bordered on anxiety, a psychological vulnerability common in those deeply attached to family outcomes. Not necessarily, Mr. Cavendish, she replied. It is often the case that someone seeks to create confusion and manipulate perception. The person fleeing may be guided by fear, or may wish to observe the reactions their actions provoke. She moved to the window, peering out at the rain-slicked courtyard. The fog had thickened, veiling movement and sound. She considered the possibilities: the missing will, Eleanor's disappearance, the letters instructing careful observation. the East Wing hidden passage, and now the fleeing stranger. Each thread suggested careful orchestration. Someone in the manor, or closely linked to it, was attempting to direct outcomes from behind a veil of deliberate ambiguity. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to alibis. The household had been meticulously observed over the past nights, yet gaps now appeared. The mid-evening movements of certain family members could not be accounted for. With certainty, the timing of meals and lights out provided only partial verification, and minor inconsistencies in statements hinted at either deception or selective memory. Each alibi now seemed less secure, and the sighting at the station suggested that someone had deliberately positioned themselves to avoid detection while creating an impression of innocence elsewhere. The maid entered quietly, whispering of a carriage spotted leaving the village at an odd hour, its driver unfamiliar. Miss Marple noted the details, the direction, the timing, the potential connections to prior observations. Someone had the means to travel undetected in the fog, using cover of the night to manipulate movement and observation. This was not random. It was deliberate, strategic, and indicative of careful forethought. Miss Marple turned to Thomas. Consider this: the footprints, the scrap of paper, the glance of recognition on the platform. They all point to someone who is familiar with the manor and its residents. Not merely familiar, but intimately so. And they are aware of how to move unseen, to observe without being observed. She paused, noting the faint tremor in Thomas's hands as he processed her words. Fear, Mr. Cavendish, is a potent motivator, but so is opportunity. We must consider both as we unravel this mystery. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. The butler entered, face pale. Madam, a telegram has arrived, addressed to you. It bears no signature, only these words: midnight observations reveal more than the day's scrutiny. Follow the path where the East Wing meets the night. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with the recognition of pattern and purpose. The East Wing once more, the hidden passage hinted at previously, and now a temporal cue connected to the midnight train. The interweaving of space, time, and observation was deliberate, a test of perception and deduction. She carefully folded the telegram, placing it alongside the letters and the scrap from the platform. Her mind turned over the possibilities. Someone was orchestrating events to reveal Eleanor's fate, the missing will, and perhaps other secrets of the manor, but only for those observant and clever enough to notice the clues and act upon them. Missteps or assumptions could easily lead the household astray. Lady Ashbury's voice trembled as she addressed the room. Must we follow such instructions? It seems dangerous, even foolish. We cannot simply chase shadows in the night. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. It is not danger we must fear, Lady Ashbury, but inattention. The night reveals truths the day conceals. Observation, patience, and logic will serve us better than fear. A clock chimed the hour, faintly audible through the manor's thick walls. Midnight. The time indicated in the telegram, the hour of movement, the moment when the stranger had fled. Miss Marple noted the synchrony, the way events had been choreographed to unfold precisely at this juncture. The connections between the letters, the East Wing passage, the missing will, and now the midnight train were becoming clear. Someone was guiding perception, creating a trail for discovery. As the household gathered near the library hearth, Miss Marple shared her deductions. The stranger at the station is not merely fleeing, he is testing us, watching our reactions. The footprints, the scrap of paper, the timing, the telegram, all are intentional. Someone wishes for the truth to be discovered, yet only by those willing to observe, analyze, and follow the subtle instructions. Thomas's voice was urgent. "Do you think it is Eleanor? Could she have sent the messages herself?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Unlikely, Mr. Cavendish. The handwriting, the phrasing, the precision of movement, all suggest a different hand, one familiar with the manner and its secrets, but not directly under immediate duress. Eleanor may be the key, but the orchestration belongs to another." A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it a faint trace of lavender. Miss Marple inhaled subtly, noting the continuity of scent, the careful placement of clues, and the psychological manipulation in play. Each element was deliberate, each misdirection purposeful. The web of secrets and intentions was tightening, and the next step, beneath the east wing, in the hidden passage, promised revelation, confrontation, and the uncovering of motives long concealed. As she replaced the letters in her reticule, a soft, almost imperceptible sound came from the corridor. Footsteps, deliberate and quiet, pausing at the threshold of the drawing room. Miss Marple's eyes met Thomas's. "Someone watches," she murmured, "and soon the shadows we chase will reveal themselves." The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shapes across the walls as if the manor itself whispered warnings. The chapter closed with the sense of imminent discovery. The stranger on the midnight train, the unraveling alibis, the hidden passage beneath the east wing, and the carefully placed letters all converged in a delicate tapestry of suspense. Miss Marple's mind, ever sharp, understood the orchestration, yet even she could not predict fully what truths awaited beyond the next door, in the murky shadows where fear, intention, and opportunity intersected. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Maid. Miss Marple arrived at Ashford Manor in the grey half-light of a rainy morning, the sky heavy with the promise of another storm. The manor, which had seemed merely imposing on sunnier days, now appeared almost sinister, its stone walls glistening wet and dark, the garden paths slick with rain. The household was in a state of tension that verged on hysteria. The maid, young Clara Henshaw, who had previously provided Miss Marple with small but crucial insights, was missing. No one had seen her since late the previous evening, and her bed had been slept in, her belongings untouched. The discovery, or rather, the lack of discovery, had left the household in frantic uncertainty, their fear and guilt flickering in every glance. Miss Marple stepped into the drawing room, noting the anxious expressions of the family members and staff. Lady Ashbury, usually composed, wrung her hands with an almost tangible despair. Thomas Cavendish's face was pale, his mouth tight with frustration, while the butler's eyes darted nervously between the windows and the doorway. Even the ever-diligent cook, normally impervious to drama, seemed disturbed, her apron smudged as though she had been wringing her hands in worry. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room with precision. "When a key witness vanishes," she said quietly, "it is seldom a mere accident. Let us consider who would benefit from her silence, and what the conditions of her disappearance suggest." She knelt by Clara's neatly made bed, examining the small details the household had overlooked. The blanket was slightly disturbed in the center, indicating that someone had been removed with care. The window was latched, the latch not forced, and there were no signs of hurried packing. Miss Marple noted the faint impression of muddy shoes on the carpet, partially obscured by the rug, a clue that someone had moved her deliberately rather than her leaving of her own volition. A scrap of fabric clung to the edge of the bedpost, darkened by moisture. It was from a cloak, the same coarse material used in one of the servants' outer garments. The implication was subtle, yet chilling. Someone inside the household, someone familiar with the manor's routines, had orchestrated this disappearance. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the hearth, where a faint, almost imperceptible ash smudge suggested that the fireplace had been recently disturbed. She recalled the earlier letters and the annotations on the missing will, subtle movements, hidden messages, and manipulation of perception were recurring elements in the web of intrigue that had enfolded Ashford Manor. She tapped the hearth lightly with her gloved fingers, noting a faint indentation in the stone floor near the east wing. A small key, barely visible, lay nestled in the depression. Miss Marple recognized it immediately. It belonged to a private cupboard in the east wing that she had previously examined. Whoever had removed Clara had likely intended to conceal her in that space, secure from casual detection, but accessible to those who knew precisely where to look. "Have any of you seen Clara since last evening?" Miss Marple asked. The responses were hesitant, each answer revealing more anxiety than clarity. Thomas admitted he had not, and his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease that did not escape Miss Marple. Lady Ashbury claimed she had been occupied in her room, yet her voice trembled in a way that suggested she feared exposure. The cook muttered that she had gone about her chores, but the timeline was incomplete. Small inconsistencies between the servants' statements hinted at either collusion or fear of reprisal. Miss Marple filed each observation carefully, noting the subtle tells that might unravel motive and opportunity. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the study, her steps measured, her eyes scanning the shadows that clung to the corners. She reflected on Clara's previous insights, the scraps of letters she had delivered, the observations of comings and goings, the knowledge of family interactions. Clara's disappearance was not merely inconvenient. It struck at the heart of Miss Marple's investigative method. Whoever had orchestrated it understood the value of silence and the leverage it provided. Miss Marple considered the psychological implications. Fear could be weaponized, and secrecy could be maintained not merely by threats, but by the strategic removal of those capable of revealing truth. She examined the key and the nearby letters once more, observing the ink, the direction of the handwriting, and the particular phrasing used. One annotation stood out, a small symbol, barely perceptible, indicating a meeting or an important moment. Miss Marple realized that Clara had likely witnessed something significant, something that implicated a family member or staff member in prior events, the disappearance of the bride, the missing will, or the orchestrations involving the East Wing. Whoever had removed her understood her potential as a witness and moved decisively to silence her. Miss Marple then considered who had the most to gain. Thomas, deeply attached to the manor and its inheritance, had opportunity and motive, though his nervous demeanor suggested hesitation rather than malice. Lady Ashbury's interest in controlling the estate's narrative and preserving her social position was palpable. She had the psychological acuity to plan removal carefully. Among the servants, only a few had the access and awareness to execute such a disappearance without leaving immediate detectable traces. The subtle mud, the cloak fragment, the key in the hearth, all pointed towards someone intimately familiar with the household, someone confident in their ability to manipulate perception and avoid suspicion. The study's window overlooked the back gardens, slick with rain and illuminated only by the flickering lantern Miss Marple held. She observed faint footprints leading from the garden path toward the east wing, partially obscured by the wet earth and creeping fog. The pattern suggested someone carrying a small weight, perhaps a person, yet the marks were cautious, deliberate, designed to mislead an observer into assuming a solitary figure had passed. Miss Marple noted the angle of movement and the careful avoidance of the main entrance, recognizing the precision of someone accustomed to moving undetected within the manor's grounds. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, where Thomas had been pacing, and Lady Ashbury stood by the window, watching the rain in silence. "We must consider not only opportunity, but the psychological dimension," she said. "Fear, anxiety, and the desire to control perception are as potent as any physical action." She paused, noting the slight tightening of Thomas's jaw, the way Lady Ashbury's fingers pressed together almost obsessively, and the librarian's quiet, watchful presence in the corner. Each had a motive, yet each also carried a tell, a subtle sign of intent, of culpability, or of internal conflict. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. The butler entered, holding a small note. Miss Marple took it and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was hurried, yet familiar. It matched previous messages she had examined. The note read simply, "She is where the letters and keys converge. Search beneath the hearth in the east wing. There you will find what you seek, if you know where to look." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. The instructions were deliberate, guiding the observant to a precise location while obscuring the path from casual detection. Whoever had taken Clara had left just enough trace for discovery, but only by someone meticulous, patient, and logical. She moved toward the east wing, Thomas and Lady Ashbury following closely, their expressions tense. The corridor was dim, the lamps casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the worn carpets. Miss Marple examined the hearth carefully, noting a slight indentation, a faint smear of ash, and the small key she had found earlier. Kneeling, she lifted the hearthstone, revealing a narrow cupboard built into the wall, its interior dark and musty. Carefully, she opened the door, and there, huddled inside, was Clara, her eyes wide with fear, but unharmed. She trembled as Miss Marple extended a reassuring hand. "Clara, my dear, you are safe now," Miss Marple said gently. "But we must understand why you were removed. Did you see something? Hear something?" Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. I saw someone moving the will, madam, and they tried to stop me from telling anyone." Her words confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The maid had been silenced because she possessed knowledge directly implicating a person within the household. Miss Marple helped Clara to her feet, her mind racing as she pieced together the implications. Whoever had orchestrated this disappearance had confidence not only in their secrecy but in their ability to manipulate the household's perception of events. They had chosen the night, the conditions of fog and rain, the East Wing as a hiding place, all calculated to delay discovery while maintaining control over information. The psychological depth of the perpetrator became increasingly clear to Miss Marple. The manipulation of fear, the orchestration of misdirection, and the careful control of knowledge indicated not merely opportunity, but an acute understanding of human behavior. The missing will, the letters, the secret annotations, the East Wing passage, the midnight train, and now Clara's abduction. All formed a pattern, a map of deception, carefully drawn and executed by someone both clever and determined. Miss Marple returned Clara to the safety of the drawing room, where she was wrapped in a warm shawl. Lady Ashbury and Thomas listened intently as Miss Marple relayed the findings and observations, her voice calm, deliberate, and exacting. Each clue, Each movement, each reaction of the household was catalogued and connected. The disappearance of the maid had revealed not only the lengths to which someone would go to control knowledge, but also the critical importance of observation, patience, and deductive reasoning in uncovering truth. As the storm outside intensified, Miss Marple contemplated the next steps. The clues she had gathered, muddy footprints, cloak fragments, keys, letters, and now Clara's testimony, painted a vivid picture of deliberate orchestration. She understood that the next revelation, the confrontation with the individual manipulating events, would be imminent and decisive. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed from the corridor, a soft shuffle, almost imperceptible, yet distinct against the rain's constant patter. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind calculating, her senses alert. Someone was moving through the manor, deliberately, quietly, yet aware that discovery was possible. The sound ceased abruptly, leaving the household in a tense, expectant silence. Miss Marple's gaze met Thomas's. "We are close, Mr. Cavendish, very close, and whoever seeks to control the narrative will soon reveal themselves, or be revealed." The chapter ended with the household gathered, the storm raging outside, and the understanding that Clara's return was merely a prelude. The missing will, the letters, the hidden East Wing passages, and the orchestrated movements of shadowy figures pointed toward a climax of revelation, a confrontation that would unravel the tangled web of secrets, motives, and manipulation. Miss Marple's mind, sharp and vigilant, was already plotting the careful, deliberate steps that would lead to truth and to justice. Chapter 7. A Whisper from the Dead. Miss Marple arrived at Ashford Manor under a sky weighed down with storm clouds, the rain lashing against the tall, narrow windows like small armies of needles. The house seemed almost alive with tension, each creaking floorboard, each groan of timber, carrying whispers of long-buried secrets. She had been summoned urgently by Thomas Cavendish, whose voice trembled with excitement and fear, and she understood immediately that the events of the past nights, the bride's disappearance, the locked room, the vanished maid, and the cryptic letters, were about to converge in a revelation that might shake the household to its foundations. The drawing room, usually the center of calm domesticity, was now cluttered with papers, old books, and scattered letters. Lady Ashbury sat stiffly in her chair, her face pale beneath the dim lamplight, while the household staff hovered in anxious silence. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle signs of fear and hidden agendas. Thomas approached her cautiously. "Miss Marple, it's in the East Wing. A secret room. I think it has been hidden for years. My grandmother never spoke of it, but I found a key behind a loose panel in the library." His hand trembled slightly as he held out a small brass key, its surface dulled by age. Miss Marple accepted it and turned it over thoughtfully, noting the worn grooves and the faint traces of fingerprints. "Keys tell stories, Mr. Cavendish," she murmured, "not merely of locks, but of the hands that have held them and the secrets they guard." They moved quietly along the East Wing corridor, the lamplight flickering and throwing long shadows across the faded wallpaper. Miss Marple observed every detail, the uneven polish of the floorboards, the faint scratches near the skirting, the way the rainwater seeped under the window frames, leaving subtle trails that indicated recent movement. When they reached the concealed door, a panel in the wall, disguised as a bookshelf, Miss Marple paused, noting the precision of its construction. This was no ordinary hiding place. It had been designed to conceal something of immense importance, meant to remain undisturbed for decades. She inserted the key carefully, and with a soft click, the door swung inward to reveal a small, dust-laden room, its walls lined with shelves of books, ledgers, and what appeared to be personal effects of a long-dead occupant. Miss Marple stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of must and age. A faint tremor of wind stirred the pages of an open diary on a small writing desk, and she bent down, brushing away dust to reveal the name inscribed on its cover. Eleanor Ashbury, 1892 to 1918. Her pulse quickened. This was a diary belonging to an ancestor whose life had been shrouded in mystery, whose untimely death had left gaps in the family's recorded history. Miss Marple opened it carefully, noting the careful, flowing script and the small, deliberate annotations in the margins. The entries spoke of domestic life, the expectations of a wealthy family, and hints of tension beneath the surface of the Ashbury household. Yet one line stood out, written in a sharper hand, almost as if it had been added under duress. He watches and manipulates. The East Wing knows too much. Only those who read the letters will understand. Thomas's eyes widened. Could she have known about the hidden passages? About the letters? Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind weaving together the threads of the past and present. It appears, Mr. Cavendish, that the Ashbury penchant for secrecy is not new. Eleanor's warnings suggest that manipulation, observation, and the concealment of knowledge have long been tools within this household. The clues we have, the missing will, the letters, the hidden passages, and now the diary, are all part of a pattern established decades ago. She moved toward a section of the wall that seemed slightly out of alignment. The wallpaper faded differently. The wood beneath, faintly warped. Pressing gently, a hidden latch clicked, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with the thrill of discovery. Secret rooms are often more than mere hiding places. They are repositories of intention, of truth, and sometimes of confession, she murmured. Thomas glanced at her anxiously. Do you think someone has been here recently? Miss Marple considered the evidence. The dust is slightly displaced near the staircase, and the air carries the faint scent of lavender, a deliberate echo of the bride's perfume, or perhaps a mark left by someone who wishes to mislead us. The subtlety is intended to draw attention while obscuring the true purpose. Whoever moved here was careful, observant, and intimately familiar with the household's routines. They descended the staircase cautiously, the narrow walls damp and cold, the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the shadows. At the bottom, they entered a small chamber, bare except for a locked chest and a writing desk covered in dust and cobwebs. Miss Marple approached the chest, noting the padlock's scratches and the faint smudges of fingerprint in the dust around the lock. Someone had opened this chest recently, or at least attempted to, and in doing so, left subtle traces of their presence. She lifted the lid with care. Inside were documents, letters, and a small bundle of personal effects, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. Among them was a letter, dated decades prior, that referenced a clandestine arrangement concerning the Ashbury estate, mentioning names that were now long forgotten, but whose significance could now explain patterns of behavior within the current household. Miss Marple traced the handwriting carefully, noting the slight irregularity in pressure that indicated stress or urgency. This was a document meant to be secret, and its contents had been known to only a few. Thomas leaned over, whispering, "Could this be connected to the bride's disappearance, Miss Marple?" "To the will," she nodded thoughtfully. "It is entirely possible. The manipulation of knowledge, the concealment of documents, and the orchestration of movement within the household all point toward a continuity of intent. Someone now, in our time, is continuing a tradition of secrecy, perhaps exploiting it for personal gain." Miss Marple turned to examine the diary more closely. One passage, overlooked at first, suggested a meeting of two figures in the dead of night, discussing the concealment of property and the enforcement of silence. She noted the reference to the East Wing again, confirming the significance of this hidden room in the context of Ashbury family secrets. "The diary confirms what the letters hinted at," she said. "There has long been knowledge meant to be hidden, observation meant to be controlled, and messages crafted to guide perception. Whoever is acting now is consciously following a precedent set by their ancestors." Lady Ashbury, who had been silently observing, spoke with a tremor in her voice. "You mean someone is using history against us, to manipulate events, to control outcomes?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. Knowledge, once gathered and hidden, becomes power, and those aware of its presence can wield it to influence the household, to silence witnesses, and to direct attention away from inconvenient truths." Miss Marple then noticed a faint smudge on the desk surface, as if someone had recently wiped the desk hurriedly. She picked up a fragment of paper tucked beneath the blotter, a note written in hurried pencil. "The East Wing conceals more than letters. The truth lies beneath what the living fear to see." Her heart quickened. This was no ordinary diary discovery. It was a deliberate clue, left by someone aware that Miss Marple would investigate, guiding her to the hidden chest and hinting at the next layer of secrets yet to be uncovered. Thomas swallowed hard. Could someone have been hiding things in this secret room recently? Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "It appears so. The displaced dust, the fingerprints, the subtle misdirections, they are consistent with deliberate observation and manipulation. Someone has used this room not only to hide evidence, but to create a chain of clues, testing the household and those investigating." She paused, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "And consider the psychological dimension. Fear, secrecy, and the orchestration of perception are tools in the hands of someone who understands human behavior. The Ashbury family history shows that knowledge can be weaponized, and those who inherit not just property, but legacy, often inherit cunning as well." A sudden sound, faint but distinct, a floorboard creaking above, made them all tense. Miss Marple listened carefully. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though someone were pacing, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. The implications were chilling. The manipulator was not merely in the past. They were present, observing, ensuring that the investigation proceeded according to their plan. Miss Marple examined the diary once more, tracing the marginal notes. One, in particular, caught her attention, a small symbol indicating urgency, a combination of letters and numbers that suggested time and place. Coupled with the note from the desk, it hinted at a location beneath the East Wing that had yet to be explored. A chamber within a chamber, a final repository of secrets intended to remain hidden. The layers of concealment and guidance revealed a mind both meticulous and strategic, capable of orchestrating fear, misdirection, and revelation in equal measure. She looked at Thomas and Lady Ashbury. "Prepare yourselves," she said quietly, her tone carrying both warning and certainty. "The next step is beneath the East Wing. There is more to discover, and it will challenge what you believe about your family, your home, and perhaps even yourselves. Secrets are rarely idle, and those who keep them often do so with precision and intent. We are about to confront one such legacy. The candlelight flickered as they turned back toward the narrow staircase, the rain hammering against the windows, the wind moaning through the eaves. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner a potential hiding place for truth, every sound a whisper from the past. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the diary, the letters, the hidden passages, and the orchestrated movements of the household into a coherent pattern. She understood, with that peculiar clarity of hers, that the revelations awaiting them would change everything. The missing will, the bride's disappearance, the vanishing maid, and now the hidden secrets of the dead all converged here. As they descended once more into darkness, the storm outside a relentless drum, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a small movement, a shadow flitting across the far wall, barely perceptible. Someone was present, someone was watching, and someone, carefully, deliberately, was guiding the unfolding of events toward a moment that would reveal the truths long buried beneath the Ashbury legacy. The chapter closed with the sense of imminent confrontation, the hidden room beneath the east wing, the diary whispering secrets from the past, and the realization that the manipulator was present, observing, and orchestrating. Miss Marple's mind was alert, her deductions precise, and the household, tense and fearful, stood on the brink of revelations that would shatter illusions, expose motives, and lead inexorably to the next step in the unraveling of the Ashbury mystery. Chapter 8. The Lace That Knew No Lies. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the tall windows of Ashford Manor, as Miss Marple stood in the dimly lit workroom, her eyes fixed on the black lace gown that had once adorned the missing bride. It was draped across a worn oak table, the fine threads glistening under the flickering lamplight, intricate patterns forming delicate motifs that seemed almost alive. The room smelled faintly of mothballs and damp fabric, and the wind rattled the shutters with a hollow, urgent sound that seemed to echo the unease in the household. Miss Marple's fingers traced the lace with care, noting the meticulous embroidery, the subtle imperfections, and the tiny remnants of thread that suggested it had been hastily handled or altered. She had requested the gown be brought from the attic, where it had been stored untouched since the bride's disappearance. The maid, visibly nervous, hovered nearby, wringing her hands, while Lady Ashbury and Thomas Cavendish observed silently, their expressions taut with anxiety. "It seems," Miss Marple said softly, "that even the finest lace can bear witness to events its wearer cannot recount. Threads remember what people wish to conceal." Her gaze fell upon a small, jagged tear in the hem, scarcely noticeable, yet deliberate. It had not been caused by accident. It was too precise, the edges suggesting a sharp instrument had been used to slice the delicate fabric. Miss Marple crouched closer, her eyes scanning the gown under the lamplight. In the small tear was a glimmer, a tiny metallic thread, gold in color, interwoven almost invisibly into the black lace. She plucked it carefully, noting the faint residue of dried soil and ash clinging to its fibers. The clue was subtle, easily overlooked by anyone not accustomed to the careful observation of minute details. Yet it spoke volumes. The bride had come into contact with something or someone that left an indelible mark, and it was encoded in the very garment she had worn. "Miss Marple," Thomas whispered, his voice tight with curiosity. "What does it mean? Can the lace tell us who might have—" His words trailed off, unspoken, as the implications settled into the room. Miss Marple's eyes were narrowed, her mind already weaving the threads of logic and deduction. "It tells us," she said, "that the bride was in proximity to a person or object that left a trace, something deliberate, something calculated. It is unlikely to be random. And whoever was responsible knew enough to ensure only careful observation would reveal the truth." She examined the patterns in the lace itself, noting a faint smudge of soot along one of the hem's embroidered vines. The soot was not recent. It bore the characteristics of coal ash, as if it had come from a fireplace that had long since burned down. Yet it was fresh enough to suggest that the bride had been close to a fire, or someone had handled her gown near one within the last several days before her disappearance. The detail Miss Marple recognized was a link between the bride's last known location and the hidden chambers in the East Wing she had investigated previously. The lace, in effect, was a silent witness, recording movements and interactions that words could not capture. Lady Ashbury shifted uncomfortably, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But who would—" she began, only to falter. Miss Marple glanced at her, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the careful control of her expression. Lady Ashbury had always prided herself on her composure, yet now she seemed to struggle to contain unease. This too was a clue. Anxiety can betray knowledge, even when words are carefully chosen. Miss Marple's attention turned to the delicate gold thread again. She held it against the lamplight, noting the faint imprint of a pattern in the weave. It was not merely decorative, it was functional, almost like a signature hidden in plain sight. She traced the thread's path, following the tiny twists and knots, and realized that it matched a fragment she had seen before, a small embroidery on the lining of a shawl belonging to one of the household staff. The implications were immediate and profound. A person within the household had been in close contact with the bride, close enough to transfer fibers imperceptibly and yet careful enough to avoid immediate detection. Miss Marple turned to the maid, who looked as though she might faint. "Did anyone handle this gown in recent days?" she asked gently, her voice calm but probing. The maid's lips trembled, and she hesitated. Finally, she whispered, I may have carried it from the attic to the East Wing, but only briefly. I didn't touch it much." Her eyes flicked nervously toward Thomas and Lady Ashbury. Miss Marple noted the evasive glance. It was not the maid's deception that concerned her. It was the layers of fear and the subtle ways it influenced behavior. Miss Marple's mind moved rapidly, connecting the black lace, the metallic thread, the soot residue, and the known hidden chambers. The bride's disappearance had not been haphazard. It was orchestrated with an attention to detail that mirrored the cunning shown in the handling of the missing will, the letters, and the vanishing maid. The lace confirmed proximity, movement, and manipulation, all evidence of deliberate intent. Thomas, unable to contain his anxiety, blurted, "Then, someone in the house knows more than they're saying. Someone was with her?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, and the key is in the details they left behind, not in what they attempted to hide. Observe carefully, and the truth is encoded in the traces that cannot lie." She held the gown up, examining the hem, the seams, and the faint golden glimmer. A pattern emerged, linking the bride's last known interactions with movements through the East Wing passages. The threads, the soot, the embroidery, all were a map. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance had not anticipated such meticulous scrutiny, nor had they considered the persistence of subtle, almost imperceptible clues. Miss Marple paused to consider the psychological dimension. The manipulator of events, she realized, was not merely calculating, but also confident, almost arrogantly so. They understood the household's dynamics, the fears, the hidden desires, and the vulnerabilities, yet their confidence was their weakness, for it led them to overlook the persistent observer, the quiet mind capable of connecting invisible threads. Lady Ashbury's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. "You mean, all this time, the gown, it was telling us what happened?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. The lace knows no lies, Lady Ashbury. It cannot feign ignorance, cannot conceal the proximity of one who touched it, nor the movements it witnessed. It is a silent confessor." Miss Marple then moved to the East Wing corridor, the gown carefully carried to prevent contamination, and traced the movements she had deduced from the lace. Each step was deliberate, each observation precise. She examined the floorboards for displaced dust, the faint smudges near the hidden passages, and the subtle echoes of footfalls in the damp corridors. All confirmed what the lace had whispered. The bride had been moved deliberately, handled carefully, and observed with calculation. Her deductions extended beyond the immediate evidence. She considered the behavioral patterns of the household, the anxieties, the evasions, the brief flashes of recognition or guilt. Each person had a story, a motive, and now, thanks to the lace, a potential connection to the movements of the bride. Miss Marple saw the convergence clearly. The threads, the footsteps, the hidden rooms, and the carefully orchestrated misdirections all pointed toward one individual, someone who possessed both access and the subtlety to manipulate events without detection. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed through the corridor, a rustle almost imperceptible, like fabric brushing against wood. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Someone was present, moving quietly, observing the investigation as she had observed the lace. Her mind raced, calculating possibilities, probabilities, and opportunities for concealment. Whoever had left the trace in the gown was still very much a presence, and their awareness of the investigation could change the balance at any moment. Miss Marple examined the lace once more, noting a tiny imperfection. A thread pulled slightly, as though it had caught on a ring or clasp. She traced the pattern to the hem, then to the bodice, realizing that the lace had brushed against jewelry that bore a distinctive hallmark, one known to be in Lady Ashbury's possession. The implication was subtle, yet undeniable. The bride had come into contact with someone wearing a piece of jewelry that matched this hallmark, suggesting a presence that had previously gone unnoticed. Thomas gasped. "You mean it was someone here in the house? Someone we know?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "Yes, Mr. Cavendish. The evidence is clear if you attend to it. The lace records events the mind might forget, the body might misplace, but the fabric remembers. And now we have a direction, a connection that cannot be ignored." Lady Ashbury looked stricken, her composure faltering. "But how could we have missed it? The lace, the gown?" Miss Marple offered a gentle, knowing smile. "Details often escape notice, Lady Ashbury. We see what we expect, not what is present. But when one examines carefully, observes without preconception, the truth reveals itself in the most unlikely of places." Miss Marple carefully folded the gown, preserving every thread, every hint of proximity, every fragment of truth it contained. She traced the faint golden shimmer again, her mind weaving the pattern of movements, interactions, and hidden motives. The lace had spoken, and its testimony was as clear. The bride's disappearance was no accident, no whim of fate, but the product of deliberate orchestration by someone intimately familiar with the household and its secrets. As the wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the windows, Miss Marple turned to the household. "Prepare yourselves," she said softly, "for the next revelation. The gown has guided us, revealed the subtle connections, and pointed to the manipulator's hand. The path forward is clear, but the truths it uncovers may shake the foundations of Ashford Manor itself." A sudden movement in the shadows of the corridor drew her attention, a fleeting glimpse of a figure disappearing into the darkness. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The presence confirmed her suspicion that the manipulator was still at large, aware and deliberate in their actions. The lace had spoken, but now the living observer remained, hidden, watching, and perhaps preparing the next move in a carefully orchestrated game of concealment and revelation. The chapter closed with the black lace gown resting on the oak table, its delicate threads glimmering faintly under the flickering lamplight, and Miss Marple's mind racing with the implications. Every pattern, every imperfection, every glimmer of gold led toward a person in the household, a hidden motive, and the next step in the unraveling of the Ashbury mystery. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving, as if mirroring the turbulence that was about to engulf the manor and the truths that could no longer remain hidden. Chapter 9. The Truth Buried in the Garden. The garden of Ashford Manor lay under a damp, oppressive sky, the wind whipping through the rose bushes and topiary hedges, bending the branches and scattering petals across the muddy paths. Rain had turned the soil into a dark, glistening carpet, and puddles reflected the flickering light of the manor windows like tiny, unsettled mirrors. Miss Marple stepped lightly among the beds of chrysanthemums and foxgloves, her sensible shoes sinking slightly into the sodden earth, her eyes scanning every shadow, every irregularity in the terrain. The manor's secrets, she knew, had a way of surfacing in the garden, the same place where generations of Ashburys had planted, pruned, and occasionally concealed what they wished the world not to see. Earlier that morning, she had discovered a subtle clue in the gardener's shed, a pair of muddy boots left behind in haste, with soil that did not match any of the paths or flower beds maintained by the staff. The soil was heavier, richer, and slightly tinged with clay from the estate's far corner, near the old orchard where the ground had been recently disturbed. Miss Marple deduced that someone had hidden or moved something there under cover of darkness and rain. It was, she realized, the perfect location to test her theory and set a careful trap to expose deception. She crouched near the base of a rose bush, her fingers brushing the wet petals as she observed a faint indentation in the earth, a depression that suggested recent digging. The pattern was irregular, hurried and shallow, enough to conceal an object without revealing itself to the unobservant. She straightened and made a mental note of the spot, imagining how she could guide the household members into revealing both their knowledge and their lies. Truth, she thought, often surfaces when one is gently maneuvered into the open, like a timid creature startled from cover. Miss Marple arranged for a quiet gathering in the garden later that afternoon, using the excuse of reviewing the estate's boundaries and discussing the management of the grounds. Lady Ashbury and Thomas, along with the remaining staff, were called to accompany her. The rain had lessened to a fine drizzle, and the garden smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. As the group moved along the paths, Miss Marple noted the subtle glances exchanged between Thomas and his mother, the restless fidgeting of the gardener, and the cautious pacing of the maid who had helped bring the bride's black lace gown from the attic. Each movement, each gesture, was a clue. She stopped near the recently disturbed patch of earth and allowed her gaze to linger thoughtfully on the ground. "It is curious," she said aloud, "how certain things, though concealed, seem to leave their mark. One need only look carefully to see what has been hidden from plain sight." The words were casual, yet pointed, like a breeze stirring the surface of the soil to reveal what lay beneath. Thomas knelt to examine the area, brushing away wet leaves. "It looks like someone has been digging here recently," he remarked, his voice betraying surprise. Miss Marple nodded subtly. "Indeed, the disturbance is recent, though not entirely careless. Someone wished to hide an object without leaving too much evidence. And yet, the earth betrays them if you know how to read it." The maid shifted uneasily. "Do you mean someone in the house?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the gathered figures, noting each micro-expression, each hesitation. "It would appear so. And the question, my dear, is not merely who acted, but why. Motives, after all, are often more revealing than the act itself." She gestured to Thomas and Lady Ashbury. "Would you mind showing me the place where you keep your most valued documents, letters, or small treasures?" They exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance before nodding and led her toward the West Wing study. Miss Marple's attention, however, remained partly on the garden, for it was here that subtle misdirection and human error often betrayed more than any confession could. Returning to the disturbed earth, she picked up a small trowel, carefully scraping away the top layer of soil. Beneath it, she revealed a leather-bound journal, damp but intact, its edges muddied. She wiped it gently and opened it, noting the handwriting inside, precise, deliberate, yet filled with urgency. The journal belonged to someone within the household, chronicling movements, observations, and hints of concealed interactions surrounding the bride's disappearance. There were mentions of hidden passages, of letters never delivered, and of subtle manipulations designed to divert suspicion. Miss Marple read a few lines aloud, her voice steady, the rain falling softly around them. "The East Wing remains my watchtower, yet even there not all is seen. Trust the threads, not the words. Trust the movements, not the faces." Thomas's brow furrowed. "It's someone's record of what's been happening. But why bury it here?" Miss Marple glanced at the indentation nearby, noting the soil still loose from hurried replacement. "Because the truth is often safest beneath the earth, hidden in plain sight. The person who buried this wanted it preserved, yet secret, to be found only by one who observes the garden as carefully as the house itself." Her eyes swept over the assembled household. "And consider how anxiety betrays motive. One who fears exposure will exhibit subtle signs of agitation, touching objects unnecessarily, avoiding certain paths, glancing toward corners that might contain observers. Watch, and these signs will reveal themselves." Miss Marple then placed the journal back in the soil, leaving it partially visible, and guided the household to follow a series of deliberate paths along the hedges, pausing occasionally to comment on the plants, the layout, and the placement of decorative features. It was a careful orchestration, designed to provoke observation, suspicion, and inadvertent disclosure. Moments passed. Then a sudden movement drew her attention. The gardener, whose gloves had been damp and hands trembling, bent to adjust a hose near the roses. As he did so, his coat brushed against the partially buried journal, and a faint exclamation slipped from his lips. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Ah," she said softly, "the truth can be coaxed into revealing itself when one's attention is drawn to the right spot." Lady Ashbury gasped. He knew it was there." The gardener's face turned pale, and he began to stammer. I thought, I meant no harm. I wanted to—" Miss Marple's sharp gaze cut through the fluster. "You had a motive to conceal something, and the garden provided the perfect cover. But in attempting to move the journal or ensure its concealment, you betrayed knowledge of its location." Thomas stepped forward, confused and angry. Why would anyone keep a journal like this hidden in the garden? And how is it connected to the bride? Miss Marple held up the small book, her fingers poised over the cover. The journal contains observations and confessions. It documents who moved through the house, who interacted with the bride, and even who handled the black lace gown. The garden, however, contains a second clue. Remnants of soil on the bride's gown match the soil where this journal was buried. This is not coincidental. It is deliberate, intended to link or mislead, to establish presence or innocence, depending on one's interpretation. The maid gasped. "You mean someone planted soil on the gown to confuse us?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. The manipulation is subtle. A clever hand can orchestrate evidence to appear accidental, yet when carefully observed, the pattern emerges. Here, in the garden, the soil, the flowers, the placement of objects, all serve as witnesses." Miss Marple then directed attention to a narrow path between the rose beds and the yew hedge. "Observe the footsteps," she said, pointing to slightly sunken impressions in the mud, barely perceptible. The arrangement, depth, and direction suggest that one person moved hurriedly, returning to a point of concealment, and then departing under cover of darkness. Compare these impressions with the soil residue on the gown and the boots left in the shed. The match is exact. This person intended to manipulate perception, but nature, rain, and observation have betrayed them. Lady Ashbury looked stricken, glancing at the gardener. It's him?" Miss Marple's gaze remained calm but piercing. "The garden has spoken. The journal, the disturbed earth, and the traces on the gown all converge. The gardener was present when the gown was handled, when the journal was buried, and when soil was displaced deliberately. But consider the psychological dimension. Fear, loyalty, or perhaps a promise to protect another can explain why he acted." The gardener's voice trembled. I only wanted to protect the family. I thought if the evidence was hidden, no one would be harmed. I didn't know it would. It would escalate." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Protection is a common motive, yet concealment can have unintended consequences. Truth, once buried, exerts pressure, demanding revelation. The garden, like human memory, cannot remain entirely still." She stepped back, observing the interplay of shadows, rain, and foliage. Every element of the garden had been used to conceal and to reveal, to mislead and to instruct. The delicate choreography of movement, observation, and concealment was now laid bare. Miss Marple's attention returned to the partially visible journal. "We will recover this carefully. Every word, every notation, every subtle clue matters. The garden has not only concealed truth, but guided us to it. Yet there is one final consideration. Someone else may have been aware of these actions, observing, directing, or influencing. The manipulator may still be at large, watching how we respond, anticipating our deductions. A sudden flicker of movement in the corner of the yew hedge caught her eye, a shadow flitting too deliberately to be the wind. Her pulse quickened. The manipulator remained present, observing, their plan unfolding further. She straightened, her calm demeanor hiding the thrill of anticipation that comes from nearing the heart of a long-concealed secret. The chapter closed with the rain intensifying, the soil glistening with wet truth, the partially uncovered journal lying amid the rose petals, and Miss Marple's sharp mind piecing together the subtle patterns of deceit, loyalty, and fear. The garden, silent yet eloquent, had revealed its testimony, a trail of evidence linking soil, lace, footsteps, and buried documents, and hinting at the final layers of deception still waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 10. The Footsteps Nobody Heard. The manor was wrapped in a thick, restless fog that seeped through every crevice, curling around the corners of the drawing room and making the dim lamplight appear muted and hesitant. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, the fire's glow flickering across her face as she examined a set of floorboards, polished but faintly scuffed, in a quiet corner of the room. The household had gathered at her request, the servants uneasy, Lady Ashbury composed but tense, and Thomas Cavendish standing awkwardly by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked gardens. Something, Miss Marple felt, had been overlooked, a subtle, almost imperceptible clue that connected the scattered threads of the bride's disappearance, the vanishing maid, and the black lace gown. She leaned forward, resting her fingers lightly on the floorboards. "Footsteps," she murmured. The others exchanged confused glances. Yes, footsteps, and not just any footsteps, but ones that passed through this room on the night of the bride's disappearance. They were careful, measured, and deliberately muted, yet their presence left an echo for those with the patience to notice. Lady Ashbury's voice trembled ever so slightly. "But no one heard anything. Nothing at all. How could you know?" Miss Marple's eyes met hers. Because when one listens with more than the ears, when one observes the subtleties of floor polish, the wear of a rug, the disturbed dust on a windowsill, footsteps can be found even when unheard. She motioned to Thomas, who had been staring at the fireplace. "Do you recall, Mr. Cavendish, how you found the bride's bouquet near the East Wing corridor, as though discarded in haste?" He nodded. "Yes, I thought perhaps she had dropped it herself." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Ah, but that would require a presence we now know existed. Someone moved deliberately, leaving the bouquet to mislead, and yet left traces their careful steps could not conceal." Her gaze drifted to the corner where the shadows pooled, thick and dark under the firelight. "Observe the dust along the skirting board here," she continued, tracing a finger along the faint line of discolored particles. "It is shifted in a pattern that suggests someone passed through repeatedly, their feet angled to avoid creaking boards. Most would never notice, but a careful observer can reconstruct the passage of a single person, even among several who moved through the manor that night." The maid shivered. "You mean someone sneaked about while we slept?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed, and the purpose was deliberate, to mislead, to conceal, to manipulate perception." She paused, her mind reviewing the events already gathered, the vanished bride, the mysterious black lace, the the partially buried journal in the garden, and the subtle marks of soil and ash. Each of these clues now aligned, like points on a hidden map, revealing not only movement, but intention. She rose, her steps soft but precise, and walked toward the window overlooking the east wing. "I have asked you all here," she said, turning to face them, "because I wish to reconstruct the night's events. Not from what you saw or what you heard, but from what the manor itself can tell us." The household stiffened, eyes wide. Even Thomas, confident in his knowledge of the estate, felt a tension tighten around his chest. Miss Marple gestured toward the worn rug, its edges frayed from years of passage. "This rug," she said, kneeling and running her hand along the fibers, "has absorbed more than the weight of feet. It holds impressions, patterns of pressure, and subtle shifts in pile that tell the story of someone moving cautiously, deliberately, to avoid notice." She pulled back a corner of the rug, revealing faint scuff marks on the wooden floor beneath. Notice the alignment. One foot slightly angled, the other heel raised, an attempt to silence a step. Someone who knew the house well, who knew which boards creaked and which did not. Thomas frowned. But who? And why? Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with the thrill of deduction. The one who moved so carefully had knowledge, opportunity, and motive. They were familiar with the hidden passages, aware of the servant routines, and confident enough to manipulate perceptions. And yet they left this trail, unintentional, but revealing. It tells us who approached the bride, who handled the gown, and who ensured the journal. In the garden remained hidden until the proper moment. Lady Ashbury's composure faltered. "You mean someone here orchestrated everything?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, and the evidence of their presence, while subtle, cannot be ignored. Footsteps, dust displacement, scuff marks, these are the fingerprints of movement, the testimony of absence disguised as silence." Miss Marple then focused on a small fragment of thread caught between the floorboards near the east wing doorway, a piece of black lace that matched the gown. She lifted it carefully, examining the tiny fibers. "This," she said softly, "was transferred in haste. Someone brushed against the gown, or the remnants of it, while moving quietly through this room. The lace is a silent witness, just as the floorboards are. Both reveal the presence of the manipulator." The maid gasped. "So the footsteps, they belong to someone handling the gown, maybe moving it. But who?" Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept the room. "Consider behavior, observe hesitation, and weigh opportunity against motive. One person fits all these elements." She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "Yet we must be certain, for accusations made too early can mislead as effectively as the absence of noise." She directed their attention to a narrow strip of floor near the window, where a faint smear of coal ash marred the otherwise polished surface. "This ash," she explained, "matches what was found on the hem of the bride's black lace gown. It is not coincidental. It indicates proximity to the fireplace or someone who has carried the residue deliberately. Combined with the pattern of footsteps, it tells us who moved from the east wing, through this room, and possibly back again without detection." Thomas stared, white-knuckled, realizing the implication. It had to be someone who knew the house intimately, someone who could move without creaking boards, and yet leave traces. Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. Knowledge, opportunity, and intention converge, and while most would dismiss these subtleties, careful observation exposes the manipulator's hand." She walked to the hearth, her eyes scanning the room like a delicate clockwork mechanism, noting shadows, reflections, and every irregularity in the room's worn surfaces. "Observe the mantel," she said, gesturing to the collection of family photos. The reflection in the glass, though faint, might have been glimpsed by the manipulator as they passed, confirming their path or altering it. Every detail, however small, contributes to the pattern of behavior. Footsteps, shadows, reflections, traces of dust and ash, all are pieces of a puzzle carefully laid and waiting to be interpreted. Lady Ashbury's voice wavered. "And you're certain all of this points to one person?" Miss Marple turned, calm but resolute. "Yes, but it is confirmation we seek through deduction, not accusation. Observe behavior, cross-reference the traces, and one can reconstruct events with remarkable precision. The footsteps, though unheard, have spoken, and their message is unmistakable to those who know how to listen." A sudden noise, a faint creak above in the East Wing hallway, made all heads turn. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Someone else is aware of our scrutiny," she said. "Perhaps they have been observing, or perhaps the tension has disturbed them. The house retains memory, and the living, even when cautious, reveal themselves through the smallest misstep." She returned to the floorboards, carefully pressing on a particularly subtle impression. Here, the heel was slightly deeper, as though the individual paused briefly, perhaps considering the next move or ensuring no one had noticed. Such hesitation is telling. It betrays both intent and personality. Thomas's voice broke the silence. "It's almost impossible to believe that footsteps alone could tell all this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Impossible, perhaps, to those who do not observe. Yet every sound, every mark, every shadow in a house contains a story. One must only learn how to read it." Miss Marple then stood, her eyes scanning each member of the household with a quiet intensity. "The next step," she said, "is to confront the manipulator indirectly, allowing them to reveal themselves through reaction to evidence they believe remains unnoticed. Footsteps are subtle, but behavior under scrutiny is not. One will betray themselves." The rain outside intensified, hammering against the windows with an insistent rhythm as if urging revelation. Miss Marple motioned toward the door. "We shall gather the family in the East Wing, near the corridor where the subtle traces of movement remain visible. There we can reconstruct the night's events in full, and perhaps the final truth will emerge. Remember, it is not noise that confirms presence, but the echo left behind in objects, dust, and movement." Lady Ashbury clutched her shawl, her composure thinning. "You really believe the person who orchestrated all this is here among us?" Miss Marple's expression was serene, yet her mind raced with the reconstruction of every step, every pause, every subtle footprint. "Yes, and soon we shall see whether their caution suffices, or whether the footsteps nobody heard will speak clearly enough to expose the truth." As the household moved toward the East Wing corridor, Miss Marple cast one last glance at the floorboards, the slight scuffing, the faint ash, and the delicate impression left by careful steps. In her mind, she traced the entire sequence, the movements, the hesitation, the contact with the gown, and the partial misdirection intended to confuse observation. All converged toward a single individual whose careful concealment would soon prove insufficient. A shadow flitted across the end of the corridor, barely perceptible yet unmistakable to Miss Marple's trained eye. She noted the tension in the shoulders, the minuscule hesitation in breath, the subtle twitch of a hand. The manipulator was present, aware, and perhaps confident that their careful orchestration would continue to conceal the truth. Yet the footsteps, though unheard by all, had left their story. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly in a knowing smile. The trap was set. The evidence had been revealed to those capable of noticing, and the subtle orchestration of movement, dust, ash, and lace had produced a map leading to the manipulator. Soon, she reflected, the quiet house would bear witness not only to footsteps, but to confession. The chapter closed with the household gathered at the East Wing corridor. Tension thick in the damp air, rain still pounding the roof, and Miss Marple's mind poised on the edge of revelation. Footsteps, invisible to the ear, but evident to the observant eye, had spoken. And now, she thought, it was only a matter of time before the final truth emerged, one careful step at a time. Chapter 11. The Confession. No one heard. The storm outside Ashford Manor had settled into a persistent drizzle, leaving the cobblestone paths slick and reflecting the dim lamplight like liquid silver. Inside, the air was heavy with tension, the familiar scent of wet earth and burning coal mingling in a way that seemed almost oppressive. Miss Marple had requested that the household gather in the drawing-room once more, and now, as the family and staff assembled, the room hummed with quiet apprehension. Everyone sensed that the threads of the mystery were about to converge, though none could guess just how sharply. Miss Marple stood by the tall bay window, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of lanterns outside, her hands folded in front of her, calm and deliberate. She surveyed the faces before her. Lady Ashbury's composed exterior betrayed a flicker of fear in her eyes. Thomas's posture was rigid, the tension in his jaw visible. The maid, usually shy and demure, clutched her apron as if it were a talisman, and the gardener shifted from foot to foot, glancing nervously at the door. Each was a participant, willingly or not, in a web of concealment and misdirection, and all had left their own subtle marks. Footsteps, traces of soil, half-hidden lies that Miss Marple had patiently observed. "Before we proceed," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding, "I would like us to consider the nature of truth, and how it often lingers in the quiet spaces where no one thinks to look or listen. The house itself, and even the garden, have spoken to us. Subtle movements, unnoticed sounds, displaced dust and soil. They have all left a trail, and from these one can reconstruct events with surprising clarity." She paused, letting the words settle, then gestured toward the fireplace. "There is a final piece of evidence, subtle but undeniable, which has remained concealed until this very moment. It is small, yet it is sufficient to compel acknowledgement." Thomas's eyes flicked toward the hearth, suspicion mingling with fear. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? What evidence?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The evidence is not an object, Mr. Cavendish, but a sequence of observations. Footsteps carefully placed, the soil on the hem of the black lace gown, the partially buried journal in the garden. They all point toward one who acted with knowledge, with intent, and with a motive concealed even from those closest to them." She moved slowly toward the center of the room, her gaze fixed on the gardener. "Consider the patterns of movement we observed. The careful, muffled steps along the corridor, the pauses, the hesitations, the points where the floorboards were deliberately avoided. Only someone intimate with the manor could navigate so precisely, and only someone with a compelling reason could risk being caught so subtly." The gardener's hands trembled. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," he stammered, his eyes darting to the floor. Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Oh, but you do. You handled the gown, buried the journal, and brushed the soil from your boots as if to erase evidence. Yet the traces remain. The house remembers, and so do the garden paths, the floorboards, and even the dust." Lady Ashbury gasped softly. "You cannot mean—" Her voice faltered, and she pressed a hand to her chest. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is time for honesty. The truth, once coaxed into daylight, compels confession, and it is often more revealing than fear or deception could allow." The gardener swallowed hard, his face pale and strained. I wanted to protect. I thought if the journal and the gown were hidden, no harm would come. I never intended—" He trailed off, the confession breaking, as tears welled in his eyes. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "Speak plainly. There is no need for evasion. The purpose behind your actions, the motive, must be acknowledged fully." He drew a shuddering breath. "It wasn't just protection. I was afraid of what the truth would do to the family. The bride, she was not meant to marry into scandal. There were letters she had received, things she knew, and I thought, if I concealed them, I could prevent disgrace. But when she disappeared, I panicked. I moved the gown, buried the journal, and tried to mislead anyone who might discover it." Miss Marple nodded, noting the slight tremor in his voice, the hesitation in phrasing, the glimpses of self-justification. "Fear, loyalty, and misguided duty," she murmured. "Powerful motives, yet the concealment has only complicated matters, and yet your actions have left the trail, subtle but undeniable." Thomas's voice broke the heavy silence. "So all this, the footsteps, the journal, the soil, was because of fear. You nearly destroyed everything to keep a secret." The gardener bowed his head, shame and despair evident in every line of his posture. "Yes, I only wanted to protect the family and the memory of the bride. I never thought it would—" His voice cracked, trailing into silence. Miss Marple stepped closer, her keen eyes observing every nuance. "And yet, in trying to protect, you became the instrument of concealment. But there is more," she said quietly. "One must always consider not only what is hidden, but what is sought to be revealed through concealment. The journal, though buried, contains observations and hints, and the gown, though brushed and moved, holds the faintest traces of soil and ash, connecting the actions to a particular sequence and a particular individual. We now see how intention, opportunity, and knowledge converge." Lady Ashbury's hands shook as she clutched the arm of her chair. I don't know what to believe anymore." Miss Marple's voice was soft, measured, yet firm. "Believe the evidence, Lady Ashbury. Believe what the house, the garden, and the objects themselves reveal. Footsteps, soil, lace, journals, they speak louder than conjecture. They expose the pattern that leads to truth." The gardener looked up, tears streaking his face. "I didn't mean for any of this, for her to be harmed. I only wanted to prevent scandal." Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, the motive, though protective in intent, reveals the human susceptibility to fear and control. You acted not out of malice, but from anxiety and a sense of duty twisted by panic. This, too, is revealing, and it explains much of the sequence we have struggled to understand." She turned her gaze slowly to Thomas, observing his tension, his anger, and the fleeting relief mixed with doubt. "Mr. Cavendish, the interplay of fear, concealment, and loyalty has complicated matters for everyone. But the final revelation rests not only on confession, but on observation. The unnoticed steps, the displaced soil, the faint residue on the lace. These silent witnesses, combined with verbal acknowledgement, now complete the picture. Thomas's lips pressed together. So the truth is, right here, right now. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, and yet, even with confession, we must still consider the implications. The bride's disappearance, the secrets she carried, and the sequence of concealment all point to further threads, subtle but significant, that may yet alter our understanding. Lady Ashbury's voice trembled. Then, we must examine everything, from start to finish. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Precisely. And as we do, remember, the confession no one heard is not merely about words spoken. It is about intention, movement, and subtle evidence. The footsteps, though silent, have been traced. The soil, the lace, the journal. They have spoken through their very presence. And now, with the verbal confession, we can align motive, method, and sequence in a manner that allows us to approach the final truth. The gardener bowed his head once more, the weight of his actions evident. I only wanted to protect. I never meant. Miss Marple gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Intentions are rarely as simple as they seem. Yet human psychology, when combined with careful observation, provides clarity. Your fear, your loyalty, your desire to conceal, all created the circumstances we now unravel. Suddenly, a faint sound from the far corridor, a creak, a step, or perhaps a shadow shifting, alerted Miss Marple. Her sharp gaze followed the movement, noting the subtle hesitation, the almost imperceptible recoil. Ah, she murmured. Someone else has been observing, waiting to see the confession unfold. And that, too, is revealing. Lady Ashbury clutched her hands. Another person? Here now? Miss Marple's eyes were steady. Yes, confession, though powerful, is rarely witnessed in isolation. The reactions, the subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions of those nearby often betray additional involvement or knowledge. We must observe, even now, for all truths are intertwined. The room fell silent, save for the soft patter of rain against the windows and the occasional sigh of the fireplace. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the confession, the footsteps, the soil, and the lace. The puzzle pieces, each painstakingly gathered, now formed a near-complete image, though one final revelation lingered just beyond reach. She moved closer to the gardener, her voice quiet but deliberate. And now we must consider one final question. Whose actions, influenced by fear, secrecy, or loyalty, set in motion the events that led to the bride's disappearance? We have the confession, yes, but motives can extend beyond immediate intent. Who else stood to gain or to prevent exposure in ways subtle and deliberate? The tension in the room became almost tangible, the household collectively holding its breath. Even the maid, silent until now, leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with anticipation. Miss Marple's gaze swept the faces once more, noting the fleeting hesitation of Thomas, the anxiety of Lady Ashbury, and the guilt-shadowed countenance of the gardener. And this, she concluded softly, brings us to the precipice of revelation. The confession no one heard has illuminated much, yet it also casts shadows upon hidden motives, waiting to be traced and fully understood. A sudden flicker of movement near the doorway, a hand reaching for a piece of paper left on the hall table, caught her attention. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The final clue, subtle yet damning, awaited discovery. And with it, the ultimate truth of the bride's disappearance, the manipulation, and the intertwined motives of Ashford Manor's inhabitants would finally come into focus. The chapter closed with the household frozen in anticipation, rain still streaking the windows, the fireplace's glow casting shifting shadows, and Miss Marple's mind racing through the final sequence. The confession had been spoken, the footsteps traced, and yet one last revelation lingered, poised to shatter remaining deceptions and illuminate the chilling motive at the heart of the mystery. Chapter 12. The Secret Beneath the Staircase. The rain had returned with renewed ferocity, lashing against the windows of Ashford Manor and drumming a relentless rhythm on the roof. Shadows pooled in every corner, elongating across the walls and staircases, twisting the familiar into something uncanny. Miss Marple stood at the base of the grand staircase, her hand lightly resting on the polished banister. Something about the angle of the shadow, the slight unevenness of the wood, and the faint draft slipping from below had caught her attention hours earlier, and now she was certain that the manor itself was whispering the final truth, long hidden in plain sight. Lady Ashbury hovered nearby, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple, you truly believe the answer lies here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the floorboards and the rising staircase with unerring precision. "Yes, my dear. All the evidence, all the misdirections, the hidden footsteps, the vanished maid, the bride's black lace, even the confession, all led to a final, overlooked space, a place where intention and concealment converge." The household had gathered again at her request, their nerves taut with anticipation. Thomas stood by the doorway, arms crossed, a mixture of skepticism and tension etched across his features. The gardener lingered closer to the walls, avoiding the center of the room, while the maid's eyes darted nervously from Miss Marple to the staircase. The storm outside seemed to amplify every creak, every subtle draft, every whisper of movement, filling the manor with a nearly tangible suspense. Miss Marple crouched, examining the base of the staircase, her fingers tracing the grooves in the wood. "Notice here," she said softly, "the scuff marks on the floor, the slight depression of the carpet where one would never ordinarily step. These are not random. They indicate repeated contact, movement that was deliberate yet hidden. Someone traversed this path, carrying something, or perhaps someone." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "And in the quiet beneath these stairs lies what has eluded us all." Thomas frowned. "Beneath the stairs? But there is only storage, surely, just a dark closet." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Number more than storage. Look closely at the corner here, where the wall meets the stair riser. See the faint seam in the wood, almost imperceptible, and the dust that has accumulated unevenly? These are subtle indicators of a concealed compartment. Someone has utilized it, and it holds the key to the final revelation." The maid gasped softly. "A secret beneath the staircase? Could it be the bride?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Perhaps not alive, my dear, but certainly the key to understanding what occurred, who moved with intention, and why the web of concealment unfolded as it did." With a practiced motion, she pressed along the seam, her fingers finding a small latch cleverly integrated into the paneling. A faint click echoed in the cavernous hall, and slowly the panel swung open to reveal a narrow, dimly lit cavity beneath the staircase. Inside, wrapped in a dust-stained shawl, lay a bundle of papers, a fragment of the black lace, and astonishingly, the missing journal that had been buried in the garden. Its presence here rewriting the sequence of events entirely. Lady Ashbury's hand flew to her mouth. All this time, it was here? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, the journal and lace were deliberately moved here, likely after the initial panic following the bride's disappearance. The manipulator intended to obscure the trail, to mislead those investigating, and to control the revelation of information. And they almost succeeded. Thomas stepped closer, his expression a mixture of awe and anxiety. But who? Who had both the knowledge and the audacity to hide it here? Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the room, noting every micro-expression, every hesitation. The answer lies in motive, opportunity, and the subtle indications left behind in movement and behavior. Consider the confession of the gardener, the fear-driven concealment, the attempts at protection, the traces of soil and ash. Combine that with the faint dust shifts here, the previously unnoticed footprint impressions, and we can reconstruct who had the presence of mind to create a hiding place beneath the stairs. She removed the journal carefully, placing it on a nearby table. Flipping it open, she traced the entries, noting the bride's handwriting, her observations, and her concerns, letters, appointments, and veiled warnings of potential danger. Here is the missing link, she murmured. The bride herself had documented suspicions, correspondence that could have altered the course of events if discovered. The manipulator knew this, and it was precisely these records that were concealed beneath the stairs. Lady Ashbury's voice trembled. Then, the entire sequence, the disappearance, the misdirection, it was all to hide this? Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, and now that we have uncovered it, the final puzzle pieces fall into place. The footsteps, unheard but evident. The lace, brushed and moved. The journal, buried then hidden beneath the stairs. All these elements align. The pattern reveals both intent and identity. The gardener, pale and shaken, stepped forward. I didn't know about this hiding place, he confessed, his voice barely audible. I only followed the path. I thought I was helping, not realizing the full extent. Miss Marple nodded gently. Indeed, fear and misjudgment can compound concealment. Your role was secondary, but still significant. It is now crucial to consider the primary manipulator, the one whose knowledge, timing, and subtle manipulation orchestrated these movements. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Thomas. Mr. Cavendish, your familiarity with the estate, your ability to navigate unseen, and your reactions throughout the investigation are noteworthy. But even you could not predict the hidden compartment, nor the persistent observations that revealed it. Thomas's jaw tightened. I don't understand, Miss Marple. She smiled faintly. Observe, reflect, and consider the interplay of motive and behavior. The primary manipulator sought to control information, yet the physical traces left behind, the subtle disturbances in dust, the misaligned floorboards, the faint impressions near the staircase, have betrayed them. The evidence itself compels truth. Lady Ashbury's fingers trembled as she reached for the lace. So, everything, the bride, the journal, the black lace, was manipulated to conceal the truth? Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. And now that the secret beneath the staircase is revealed, we can reconstruct events in full clarity. The missing maid, the black lace, the footsteps, the confession, all converge here. Every detail previously puzzling now has an explanation. Miss Marple flipped through the journal, highlighting passages that indicated both the bride's awareness of hidden motives and the subtle manipulations of the household. Note here, she said, the bride suspected that someone close to her might act out of fear or self-interest. She left clues, observations, and records of conversations that now illuminate the sequence of events leading to her disappearance. The final concealment beneath the stairs was intended as a safety measure, or perhaps a last act of strategic hiding, but it inadvertently reveals the manipulator's anxiety and intent. Thomas spoke, his voice strained. And the identity of the one who moved the journal and lace? Miss Marple's eyes were steady, her voice calm but authoritative. That individual acted with opportunity, knowledge, and fear-driven intent, seeking to prevent scandal, to conceal potential harm, and to manipulate perception. Yet, the traces they left, the footsteps, the scuff marks, the ash on the lace, the shifts in dust, confirm both presence and action. While intention guided the concealment, the house itself preserved the truth. The gardener lowered his gaze. "It was me, then?" His voice quivered with relief and terror. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, your actions, though misguided, were an attempt to protect, to control, and to conceal. The secret beneath the staircase has now illuminated the full sequence, and while your motives were rooted in fear and loyalty, the evidence confirms the pathway of events." Lady Ashbury's voice trembled. "Then, Justice, the truth is finally here." Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. "Yes, my dear, the truth has been revealed, not through loud confession or dramatic gesture, but through careful observation, deduction, and the quiet testimony of objects and spaces that preserve memory. The secret beneath the staircase has delivered both revelation and closure." The room fell into a contemplative silence. The storm outside softened, the rain pattering gently on the windows. Miss Marple, standing near the staircase, traced her gaze along the steps and the shadowed cavity below, reflecting on the intricate web of fear, loyalty, concealment, and subtle manipulation. Each participant's actions had left traces, each choice had consequences, and now the final truth was clear. She finally turned to the assembled household. "Let this serve as a reminder," she said softly, "that even the most carefully concealed actions, the quietest steps, and the subtlest manipulations cannot hide from keen observation and careful deduction. Justice, though sometimes delayed, is preserved in the details, waiting for those willing to notice." Thomas exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and awe crossing his features. Lady Ashbury's hands trembled as she held the journal and lace, realizing the extent of what had been hidden and what had been revealed. The gardener remained silent, the weight of his actions acknowledged yet tempered by understanding. And Miss Marple, her sharp eyes softened with satisfaction, finally allowed herself a brief moment of repose, knowing the mystery of the bride. The lace, the footsteps, and the journal had been unraveled. The chapter and the 12-part mystery closed with the secret beneath the staircase fully revealed, the final manipulations exposed, and the subtle web of fear, loyalty, and intent resolved. Justice had been delivered, the haunting questions answered, and Ashford Manor, at last, allowed a tentative peace to settle in the shadowed corners of its creaking corridors.